Chapter 20. Starlust. He was yanked off the bed to the floor. Sheela pulled his face to hers. Their noses touched in the dark, and he felt her hurried breath. He could see her quivering in the moonlight, her pupils round and dark. "Where is it?" Her voice was tight. "What?" Drew realized he was in boxers and covered his nakedness with his arms. "The Starlust. I know you took one." Drew felt too good to lie. "I took it." "You what?" She grabbed his bare shoulders and looked ready to reach down his throat for the pill. "I only have so many, and I'm almost out." "What is Starlust?" "What did my brother tell you?" She shoved him hard against his bedpost. "I need to know everything." She held him against the bed, locking his arms to his sides and staring into him with her liquid black-blue eyes. The Starlust spoke for him. "Malgore knows where they are. They have a week, maybe." Sheela released him and sat back. She inhaled, thinking. Then she nodded, fixing on some unspoken and difficult decision. "I'm leaving." She stood and went for the window. Drew was slow to get up, but caught her before she climbed fully from his room. He pulled her back in. "You can't go. Get off of me." "No, this is why Bash didn't tell you. He knew you'd fly off and get yourself killed trying to save them. You do that, and it's all over. For all of us." Drew couldn't believe he'd gotten all of that out. He felt dizzy. Sheela pulled away, but paused at the window. She turned to respond when they were interrupted by footsteps on the stairs. "Under the bed," Drew whispered. Sheela flattened out on the floor and rolled beneath the box spring as Drew lunged under his quilt. The door opened. Steve switched on the hallway light. He pulled the door a crack behind him. Drew watched him through slits, his heart thumping. He tried to breathe evenly as though he'd been asleep, but the shock of being pulled out of bed had left him breathless. Steve shuffled across the room and paused at the dresser to pick up the frame, but saw it standing upright. He made a soft sound of surprise and came to the bedside. Drew listened to see if he could hear Sheela. He couldn't. Steve rubbed Drew's hair and hummed a tune. His dad seemed sad, but Drew couldn't remember why. A dark curtain shrouded the answer. Steve whispered in the dark, "I'm glad you're sneaking out and living your life. She would want that." With that, he left and shut the door behind him. Drew waited a minute before he rolled to the far bedside, the one near the window. He peered down. Sheela had already crawled out from under the bed and stared up at him from the floor. She was on her back, thoughtful and looking through him, up at his ceiling, and perhaps up beyond that through the sky and stars. "You feel good, correct?" she asked. "What are they?" "Starlust capsules. Starfighters and dimension explorers took them on long voyages or when going to war. They make you forget the most painful memories, but keep you frosty and focused. They help me forget my brother and my parents. They help me forget that Malgore wants to destroy me and everything I love. It made you forget Anne." Sheela gestured to the shirt she was wearing. When she said his mom's name, the pill's potent effect subsided. The curtain slid back and he remembered. She sighed. "I wish they lasted longer. I've often wondered what would happen if you took more than one." They lay there in silence, and Drew allowed himself a memory he hadn't thought of for a long time. He remembered his mom laying on the floor, her hands behind her head and feet up on his mattress. She would just lie there and read him her diaries from when she was young. She would tell him wild stories about her childhood, and he would tickle her feet. He'd blocked all of it out. He'd vowed never to think of those times. Her childhood had been so strange, and he was never sure what was real or made up. Something struck him. Drew sat up. "Sheela!" She was slow to look at him. "I need to show you something." He jumped out of bed and pulled the shirt on backward and inside out. "No." She lay there limp and dazed. He realized what she'd done. "Did you take more?" She smiled and saluted. "A handful." He grabbed his head between his hands. "No, not now. You have to come with me." He pulled her up. "I want to go to the movies," she complained. "Sheela!" He shook her. "You need to see this." Drew had one of her arms over his shoulder and pulled her down the hall. She leaned heavily against him. Drew could see down off the balcony. His dad was stretched on the couch, an arm thrown over his face. He was still, but not asleep yet. Sheela fell to the floor and giggled. "Sheela, no! Don't do this now!" He got her up, watching his dad. He propped her against the wall and slid her to his parents' bedroom, trying to avoid the creaking spots on the carpeted floor. They entered his parents' room, and Drew quietly nudged the door closed. He lowered her to the edge of the bed and felt his way to the closet. He slid back the door while Sheela breathed heavily in the darkness. She pulled the blue key out from her shirt on its chain. In the blue light, she peered at a picture of Anne on the untouched, dusty vanity. "She's very beautiful," Sheela slurred. "I need your light." Drew went to her and pulled the necklace over her head. "Hey!" She grabbed for it but missed. He entered the closet and shoved a row of hanging summer dresses out of the way. Hidden behind them was a box. He opened it to reveal a stack of diaries. Each spine had a year scrawled on it. He pulled several from the late 60s and early 70s. He flipped through them, feeling numb and hot. The discolored pages, the smell, the handwriting, the doodles, everything flooded back. Each page stung as he flipped them, but he kept searching. The stories were coming to him. Cracks were forming in the walls of his memory, and light was spilling in. "What are you looking for?" Sheela stumbled into the closet, peering down at the pages. Drew found it. There in the diary from 1972, June 19th. His mother was 11. There was a brief entry and a sketch of the Gladhill barn. A girl and a man were doodled beside the barn, and there was another doodle over the barn. A UFO. The cruiser. He held it up to Sheela, and she steadied herself. She shook her head and grabbed the diary from him. She held it close, inspecting the sketch in the blue light. The two looked at each other in shock. Drew whispered in a quivering voice, "When my mom was 11, she told me about a spaceman she met in a place she called Weird Space. It's what she called the cornfield." Tears shimmered in Sheila's eyes like blue pools. She gulped and let a tear fall. She looked back to the diary, combing its pages. Drew remembered the story by heart. She said he told her to keep a secret. He was going to hide something beneath the barn, and she needed to protect it. She wouldn't tell me what it was. She told me we would look together when I was 11. He took her by the shoulders. "It was my destiny to help you," she gasped. "That's why the Seekers pinged it, and we haven't seen it. It's been right under us the entire time." Her eyes were bright. She pulled him to her, and their lips connected in a clumsy kiss. Drew saw sparks, his whole body jolting. Their lips parted, and she pulled Drew to his feet. "Come on!" She was too excited to be awkward. In his room, Drew dressed quickly and radioed the team. "We found it! Mickey Mouse has warts! Mickey Mouse has warts! We found it! We found the polar! Everyone to the barn, ASAP!" Outside, Kristen's dog Cooper was barking. Her parents were out of town, and Kristen was at Sinetta's. Sheela stumbled about, smacking herself, trying to undo the effects of the starlust. "Are you okay?" "Of course, yes." "What does too much starlust do?" "I don't know." Sheela looked at him, horrified. "What did you just tell me about?" Drew approached her, wide-eyed. "You're joking, right?" She looked back, equally wide-eyed. "I know it's important, but I can't remember." "Oh no," Drew said. "Just follow me." Cooper was still barking when they went through the window and onto the roof. They crawled up the shingles. Sheela wobbled on her feet. "We're almost there. The polar. It's gonna save your people and all our worlds," Drew said. Cooper barked wildly now, charging back and forth along the fence. Drew froze when he saw it. The cruiser hovered just above his roof. Sheela had been so upset at him stealing the starlust pill and moved so quickly she'd left the Orin wall off. The ship sat exposed like an alien beacon for all of Warfield to see. "Sheela, you left the Orin wall off!" She crouched beside him, staring up at the cruiser in fascination. "You don't recognize it, do you?" She slowly shook her head. He grabbed her. "Do you recognize me?" She looked down at his hands and back to his face. She was trying, but there was no recognition. She shrank back like a frightened child. Drew felt a stab of panic. He shook himself. "It'll only last so long. It'll wear off," he yelled at her. hoping she would reassure him. She tugged away, and he took her more gently by the elbow. "We're good. We just need to wait for you to remember again. Then we can go find the polar." Cooper's barking turned to snarls. He rammed the fence, jumping and scraping against it as white, frothy saliva flew from his snout. "Cooper, quiet!" Drew called over his shoulder. He turned back to Sheela. "Look, it's okay. We've got all night. We'll just wait this out. Let me turn on the Orin wall so no one sees the ship." A distant shriek echoed across the cornfield. It came from the barn.
Slur! Slur!
It was a talk-talk. Drew listened as a chorus of tiny screams broke the still night.
Slur!
Drew looked to Sheela in disbelief and back at the ship. Talk-talks detect slurs. "You told me that." She looked at him, lost, her lip trembling. "What's a slur?" Drew looked back. The cornfield was a black mass, dead silent and still. The talk-talks suddenly went quiet. The crickets had gone quiet, as well as the birds. Only Cooper was left. Drew watched as Cooper streaked across the yard and hurdled the back fence in a frenzy. The golden coat caught the back porch lights before he disappeared into the corn. Drew listened as the barking trailed away toward the barn. Then Cooper stopped barking. Drew couldn't move. His feet felt anchored to the shingles. Sheela crouched against the roof, rolled into a ball. Drew shook himself to life. "We gotta go!" He grabbed her and hauled her up to the cruiser's open hatch. Then he looked back and saw Cooper. The golden retriever was barely visible out in the darkness, but he was looking over the fence at Drew. Cooper waved a paw. Sheela waved back. Cooper used his paw and beckoned them. Drew forced Sheela in through the hatch. He clawed his way to the cockpit and started the ship's systems. Everything hummed and glowed. Sheela huddled in a corner. Drew couldn't remember anything in the frenzy. "How do I take off?" A shadow dropped over his face as Cooper's head appeared in the windshield. Drew and Sheela both screamed as the body of an unusually large decapod crawled up onto the front of the ship. Its thick exoskeleton was jet black. Light from the neighborhood gleamed off its smooth skin. It looked like a crab with 10 muscular legs. It tossed Cooper's lifeless body off the roof, and one razor claw brought up a talk-talk, holding it like a doll. It was dead and had a partially missing ear. Larry. The slur held it up to the windshield and danced it about, as if it wanted Drew to come out and play with it. After a moment of make-believe with the talk-talk's carcass, the slur tucked the animal into a cleft on its body. The cruiser tilted as the slur climbed onto the cockpit. It passed in front of Drew, and the outboard lights revealed a horrible sight. On the slur's abdomen, just below the thorax, was a distorted human face, the mouth full of long, translucent teeth. The face had no eyes, but it opened its mouth and a purple, slimy tongue emerged. The tongue slithered over the cockpit windshield, probing. The slur tapped with its clawed legs. The tongue circled around where Drew sat in the pilot's seat, and then the mouth came near. The teeth fastened and crunched against the windshield. The slur braced its body. It was going to chew through to him. "Sheela!" Drew screamed. "Help me!" Sheela was still balled up on the floor, clutching her head. It wanted Sheela, but it was going to kill Drew to get to her. And it was going to kill him slowly. He knew that. Drew jumped from the pilot's seat and backed away. The slur was almost through, its tongue fighting to burst the cracking glass as its teeth gnawed. Drew fell over Sheela and hit the floor. Sheela crouched beside him, screaming. The tongue squeezed through a crack, dripping slime all over the flight controls. Drew saw Bash in his mind. Take care of her. That's your job now. He planned to run for the hatch and abandon her, but instead, he forced himself up and bolted for the pilot's seat. He grabbed the wheel and punched the thrusters. The ship launched away from the roof. The slur clung to the cockpit and hissed, sending a spray of hot purple saliva across the windshield. Drew couldn't see through the slur. An alarm sounded. The ground was getting close. They hit the treetops of the woods across the cornfield, and Drew yanked back on the wheel and shot them straight into the sky. The slur reached back with several powerful legs, punching the cockpit. "Hang on!" Drew screamed to Sheela. He banked and barrel-rolled blindly, but the slore clenched and clung tighter. The face opened its terrible mouth. "Sheela, I need you on the guns! It's getting through!" A crack webbed across the shield as the purple tongue wriggled through the opening. "Sheela!" Drew pleaded. She forced herself off the floor. Drew opened the ceiling gun hatch. It irised open above her. "Up there! Just pull the trigger!" Sheela seemed to be remembering. She reached up into the ceiling and took hold of the footbar. She was about to hoist herself up when the tongue squirmed all the way through the crack. It snaked around Drew's neck and yanked his head down onto the controls. The ship dipped. Sheela fell, hitting her head. Her eyes rolled over white, and she went limp. She slid across the floor to Drew's feet, unconscious. Drew's throat was being crushed. His head was going to pop. He flung his arms and pulled desperately at the slippery tongue. He couldn't breathe. The saliva burned like acid and smelled like rotting meat. The more he fought, the tighter the tongue constricted. It kept ramming him against the controls. On one hit, Drew saw Sheila's snub-nosed gun. He reached for it, one finger curling around the barrel when the tongue lifted him out of the chair and slammed him against the ceiling. The gun went flying into the cabin. The slore pulled him against the windshield. Drew could hear the slore hissing audible words through forming cracks.
"Hello, darling. Lay with us."
Drew felt himself losing consciousness as it lowered him into his chair and tightened its grip. The glass was cracking more. The rest of it would be through in seconds. Drew's hand fell to his side and felt something cool. He looked down with blurred vision. The welding tool from Sheila's belt. He took it up with his waning strength, pressed it against the slimy tongue, and powered it on. The slore let loose a deafening shriek as a blue burning ball lit from the barrel. Drew fell backward. The tongue was still coiled around his neck, but he'd seared it clean off. The slore's lime green blood spilled in through the windshield and onto the controls. The tongue wriggled about, slithering down through Drew's shirt as he climbed back into the pilot's seat and grabbed the wheel. He increased speed and then slammed them to a stop. The slore lost its grip and launched off the fractured cockpit. Drew watched through the splattering of blood and saliva on the windshield as the slore's crab-shaped body dropped down onto Warfield, its legs flailing wildly as it disappeared among the dark landscape. Drew sank into shock until the tongue wriggled up his shirt like a convulsing slug and quickly coiled around his neck again. He jumped up, screaming, ripped it off, and flung it to the floor. It tried to slither up into an open conduit, but Drew found Sheila's pistol. He grabbed it and fired bright blue plasma. The tongue exploded and pieces made wet slapping sounds around the cabin. Chapter 21. The Hunt. The others arrived in a hurry, celebrating and cheering because they'd found the polar. They were confused when Drew told them to meet behind the arcade, and they hadn't understood why Drew and Sheela didn't just pick them up. Justin had retrofitted their bikes and Kevin's rollerblades with the hover technology, and they all glided quickly to the rendezvous point. They found the cruiser behind the arcade. Drew was there, cradling a laser rifle and wearing body armor. He was covered in green, putrid-smelling goo. His own blood was dried to his nose, and burst blood vessels dotted his cheeks like freckles. They all slammed to a stop and looked him up and down. Drew spat blood from his mouth. He was still coming out of shock. "We have a slore," he muttered. "Justin, get the creature detector. Let's go kill it." Kristen stepped in. "Wait, you said you found the polar." "Yeah, and then the slore found us." "Let's use the polar to kill it," Ryan said. "Thought of that, but we don't have Sheela. It'll kill us before we uncover it, and it's gonna hurt other people. We have to protect our town. Sonetta, please go check on Sheela." Kevin was still staring at Drew in horror. "I'm sorry, where is Sheela?" "She's knocked out cold. It's up to us. Now get your stuff." The others went pale, slow to react, but grabbed gear and guns. Justin returned with the detector. Sonetta checked Sheela. She had a pulse and appeared to be okay, but she was still unconscious. They lifted her to the medic bunk in the cruiser and locked her in. The others kept asking questions. What did it look like? How fast was it? Was it scary? Was it big? Drew could only repeat as he led them forward. Check your rifles. Kristen blocked them, pointing at Drew. Hey, dummy. You look like a train wreck. This is crazy, and I'm not doing it. We don't have a choice, Chris, Ryan said. This thing's gonna kill people. Yeah, like us, Kristen said. She retreated toward the cruiser. You guys are idiots if you go. Drew sighed. Kristen, it killed Cooper. He immediately felt bad. She stopped and looked back, mouth open, ready to yell as if she were going to deny his stupid claim. But they could see her wheels turning, her green eyes drifting. She muttered, I let him out to go to the bathroom and forgot to let him back in. She stepped up in Drew's face. You're sure? He nodded apologetically. She fought back tears, her lips trembling, and her cheeks flushed. The others touched her shoulders, but she shrugged them off. She tossed her laser rifle on the asphalt. I'm done, and you guys are all jerks. She left them standing there, mounted her hoverbike, and took off. I'll go after her, Ryan said. No, we don't have time, Drew said. Justin held out the detector and switched it on. He set it to slore. The glowing, muddy yellow screen displayed grid lines and started thwapping. The radar was blank as it pinged a 60-yard radius. Drew made Justin stay beside him while the others fell in nervously behind. Kevin, Missy, watch our flank. We need to kill it before it sends a signal back to Malgore, Justin reminded them. Drew had forgotten this. Sheela had warned them Malgore would send scouts throughout different dimensions and planted with transmitters. They fanned out and stayed in the shadows and alleys, everyone watching the perimeter. Ryan moved up behind Drew. How fast are we talking? Ryan was prepping for the slore, the way he did when pitching against good hitters. Fast, big, strong, sharp claws, lots of teeth, can change shape and is really smart? Ryan chewed his lip. So, no weaknesses? Not really. Why didn't you mention this when you called us? Justin asked. This wasn't what we called about. We think we found the polar, but it won't matter if we don't live to uncover it. Cool. And true. Can we just call the police? Missy pleaded, fussing with her armored vest and helmet. Drew had had this same thought when he landed the blood-soaked cruiser. Find Grimes so he can call the army. Cops got better things to do than get killed, he said. We have the weapons we need, and we can't blow our cover now. It's up to us. Drew now saw what he'd been missing for so long. Missing dog and cat posters. A missing Willie poster with Willie's grimy bearded mugshot. A statement that the junkyard would be closed until further notice. I'm not seeing any signs of it on the detector. Maybe it went back to its dimension, Justin said. Look! Missy pointed with the barrel of her laser rifle. They stopped in front of a large dumpster behind Jack and Ray's. It was crushed like a soda can. A trail of trash and neon green blood led away from the dumpster, trailing in through the back door of the used bookstore. They entered and crept down the dark, narrow book aisles. The neon blood trickled a dotted path up over the shelves and smeared along the ceiling. It pooled in the psychology section, where the slore had apparently paused to glance at an old textbook. The book lay on the floor, open to a picture of a dissected human brain. The trail led right out the front of the store, across the street, and around behind the Safeway. They scrambled across the street, looking in every direction. Most people were asleep, but Deputy Grimes was out lurking, hunting for his brother's killer, and the killer was close. The Polars climbed up on the Safeway loading dock and ducked inside. It was a Tuesday night. No one was inside, and the store was closing soon. Drew led them in through the stockroom and peered through the push doors. Only the store manager and his cashier girlfriend were left making out at Register 1. Jazz flute Muzak played softly over the PA system. It's hurt. Sheela told me it'll look for a tunnel, burrow, or tight space to hide and heal, Drew said. Drew and the others snuck in and followed the trail of green along the back of the store, across the meat section. In several places, packages of ground beef were torn open and devoured. It had ignored the hot dogs. Even in his terror, Drew thought this was funny. They moved from aisle to aisle, taking careful aim in case the slore was just around the corner. The trail of blood led right out the front of the store. The teens making out didn't see the squad of creature hunters moving 2 by 2 out the automatic doors. The trail of blood stopped. They all looked up from the dead end to see Holly Johnson, the scrubby town drunk, staring at them from the parking lot. They stared back. He was holding a bottle in a brown paper bag, looking scruffy and greasy. He was also frozen. Without saying a word, Holly pointed. "It went that way?" Drew asked. Holly nodded. The Polars started off. "Thank you, sir," Drew said over his shoulder. Holly stood looking after them. They stopped at the end of the parking lot and crowded around the screen. The pulse had struck an object 50 yards ahead, and they looked up. "You're kidding me," Kevin said. They were across the street from the Chuck E. Cheese. It was closed, all the lights out. They hesitated a long time, watching the pulse wave strike the dot. "It's not moving. Maybe it's been neutralized," Justin gulped. Drew realized no one would move until he did. He looked both ways and hustled across the street. His poorly fitted vest and helmet jangled on him. He pushed back his helmet and nearly dropped his laser rifle. He made it, checked his surroundings, and waved Ryan on. Ryan followed, and then the others. The front doors were shut and locked. "Oh well, guess we can't get in," Kevin said. "Man up, Kevin," Missy said, shoving him with the butt of her rifle. "Drew," Ryan said. The two of them locked eyes, and Ryan shook his head. Drew didn't want to either, and if he said the word, they would retreat and give it all up. He was learning how Sheela felt. Leadership was lonely. Then he pictured Sheela back in the medic bunk and found himself running around the building to the back door. The others were slow to follow, and everyone rammed into him when they reached the back. The back door had been torn clean off and flung into the trees. A spray of neon green blood streaked across the wall beside the door and trailed inside. Drew's body armor rattled as he took short steps forward. He saw the security system panel just inside the door. The casing had been peeled away and the wires ripped up. It appears to have dismantled the security system," Justin said. The detector shook in his hand as it beeped. They filed into the back hallway, which was dark and cool from the AC. Air rattled the duct system above them. The beeping sounded in faster intervals as they neared the slore. The neon exit sign lit the whole place red. They smelled stale pizza and popcorn as they passed the employee lounge and entered the dark eatery. The animatronics stood motionless and eerie, watching them from the stage at the front of the room with their lifeless doll eyes. According to the detector, the slore hadn't moved. It was 20 yards away. "When you get him in your sights, fan out before you squeeze. We don't want to shoot each other in the back. Check your settings. Make sure your rifle is set to armor piercing. Move as one, just like Sheela taught us." They passed between the cafeteria tables. Drew eyed Chucky. The mouse looked to be watching him. He wanted to blow its head off, if for no other reason than to make sure his rifle was working. They entered the play area, a labyrinth of coin-operated rides, a ball pit, and a long indoor tunnel system of wide, multicolored tubes and slides resembling a giant's large intestine. Justin scanned the room and gulped. "He's in the tubes." Drew looked across the tubes to the long green slide leading into the ball pit. He knew what had to happen, and he knew he was the one who had to do it. He watched from outside his body as he turned to the group. "Okay," he handed Justin his rifle and took the detector. He removed his helmet and slid off his vest. "What are you doing, dude?" Ryan only called him dude when he was angry. "I can't maneuver in the tubes with the armor on." Ryan punched Drew's shoulder. "Are you out of your freaking mind?" "I'm gonna enter on the far side and flush it out the green slide into the ball pit. Then you guys blast it to hell." Drew pulled Sheela's pistol from his holster and charged it. The blue lines glowed and hummed up the short barrel. He pulled on the visor Justin had connected to the detector. The lenses displayed the grid lines through a blue haze. The dot pinged into view when it was struck by the wave. The distance between him and the slore registered on a sidebar in his visor. Drew crossed to the tower at the far end of the room. It was the only other entrance to the tubes. The tower rose 2 stories, encased in mesh netting, and the only way up was a staggered staircase one had to crawl through. Drew was now big enough that it was difficult to squeeze his body up each level. He held the gun ahead of him. He had a flashback of climbing the tower when he was younger, of feeling what his mom later told him was claustrophobia. He remembered freezing and screaming out until his dad had to squeeze up there to get him. His mom brought him back the next day and forced him to climb it again. While the other kids ate pizza, played skee-ball, and watched animatronics play a concert, Drew was facing his demons, fighting back tears and swallowing his fear. He failed another 3 times. He was the only kid in Warfield forced to go to Chuck E. Cheese. He did eventually conquer claustrophobia, but that had been nothing compared to this. Far below, Ryan and Missy dragged a table from the eatery and flipped it on its side. The assault team all crouched behind it and rested their rifle barrels along the lip. Kevin whispered, "Please God, please God, please God, please God." Drew made it to the top of the tower and came to the mouth of the first tube. It was deep and dim, but at least he could see through the dark vision goggles. He crouched and crawled along the tube. His knees felt wet and slick from the green blood along the floor. He was closing in. The beeping chimed rapidly, but the creature hadn't moved. Drew strained, trying to listen beyond the beeping. He came to an intersection. The dot appeared to his left. He turned his head that way, but slipped in the goo pooling there. It was sticky and clung to him in lacy, thick lines. As he tried to inch ahead, he slipped and fell face first into the goo. The goggles popped off. He was in the dark. He felt madly for them and dropped his gun. He lay there in the pool, petrified, his eyes and ears straining in the darkness. Then, he heard it. Scratching. The slore was inching toward him. It rounded a corner up ahead. He heard it hissing and wheezing. The scratches turned to scuttles. The entire tube shook as the slore sucked in its body and dragged itself toward him. Drew spun and slid frantically over the goo. He could hear it scuttling closer and closer, closing in. He clawed madly at the sides, his legs slipping in the trap. It had set a trap. The slore glided easily over its own pooled blood. Drew came to the far side of the tube as one of the slore's razor claws caught his shoe. It yanked him, but he caught the side of the tube and held on as his shoe popped off. Drew flung himself down the green slide with its sprawling drop, tumbling around and around in the dark. He popped out and splashed into the ball pit, met with a salvo of lasers from the overeager assault squad. The plastic balls burst and melted around him, and he felt trapped amid a firework display. He swam to the surface only after he heard Ryan scream, "Hold your fire! It's Drew!" Drew popped his head up. "Guys, it's coming!" Following a scraping noise, the black body of the slore birthed from the slide and crashed beneath the balls. With Drew still at the far corner of the pit and the slore hidden, it was too dangerous to shoot. All grew quiet as the slore lurked beneath the surface, balls trembling and shifting like rippling water. It poised itself between Drew and the team. It had him blocked off. Now the balls were still. The crew inched closer, shakily aiming their rifles. They were heaving, hearts pounding, every sense supercharged. Then there was a ripple. A few balls in the far side settled. It flattened itself along the bottom. Drew didn't move or dare take a breath. "There it is," Ryan whispered. It had moved away from Drew to the other side of the massive ball pit. A shiny black claw poked up from the balls, twitching and moving slowly about, searching for Drew. "On my mark," Ryan said. "Ready? Aim. Fire!" Blue plasma charged, hit the pit, melting balls and exploding the claw. The claw burst in green blood and went limp. Smoke and a nauseating smell of alien blood and burning plastic twisted up and filled the room. "Gotcha, mother sucker!" Kevin screamed. Drew couldn't believe it. He stood and saw the long black muscular arm with its razor claw. It lay prostrate over the top of the balls, scorched and oozing, and still twitching. Drew sloshed toward the polars, the balls a little higher than his hip. The others celebrated, but Drew noticed Ryan staring silently at the twitching arm. Ryan's smile fell, and Drew knew what his best friend was thinking. The arm was detached. Where was the rest of it? Ryan's eyes popped. "Drew, it's a trick!" That thing used its own arm as a decoy. Drew felt something playfully tickle his one shoeless foot. He didn't have time to scream. He was yanked below the surface so fast, he lost his breath. He felt the plastic balls rush over his body as he was pulled along the floor of the pit. He couldn't see the sloor and only felt its sharp razor grip on his foot. This was it. He was dead. They'd be no match for this outland monster. Then something rose in him, angry, desperate, and defiant. He'd come too far to be eaten in the ball pit at Chuck E. Cheese. He forced his hands against the floor and thrust himself up. He shot one hand up and managed to break the surface and wave wildly before being pulled back down again. He heard Ryan bark an order. The sloor released him to shield itself. His only hope for survival had come. He leapt up and dove for the side. Ryan caught him and hoisted him out. The sloor erupted from the pit. Plastic multicolored balls flew everywhere and rained down. Blue plasma flashed and streaked. Drew fell into someone. Someone else struck him in the head. A laser blast scorched past his leg. Missy screamed. The world flipped with a hard thud. Drew was suddenly on his back, pinned by one of the muscular claws. Missy lay beside him. The sloor's demonic eyeless face grinned down at them, showing Missy its translucent teeth. Another clawed arm had Ryan pinned against the wall. Kevin and Justin had been shot with wads of thick ooze and lay glued to the floor. Their laser blasts had done nothing against the sloor's exoskeleton. The sloor hissed and opened its mouth wide to eat Missy, who screamed, "Drew! Stop!" Drew pleaded. "Eat me!" He tried to fight, but the sloor pressed him hard against the cold concrete. Its teeth came down on Missy, just as a plasma blast streaked across the room, blinding them. It ricocheted off the sloor's armored back. The creature shrieked and reared up on its four hind legs, exposing its soft underbelly. Drew looked up and saw Sheela in the entranceway, Kristen behind her. Sheela aimed a rifle and squeezed the trigger before the sloor could shield its face. The next plasma charge imploded the sloor's pale face and couldn't exit the monster's thick shell. Smoke puffed from every joint on its body as the burning projectile ricocheted around inside, frying its guts. Chuck E. Cheese would forever smell like baked sloor. The creature flung Missy and Ryan, but held Drew up in the air. It shuddered and smoked and spewed neon gooey blood. Then it blew up. Drew hit the floor, the clawed arm twitching beside him. They were all shaking and dazed as Sonetta checked their injuries with her medipack. Kevin grabbed her and blubbered into her jacket. Instead of slapping or yelling at him, Sonetta held him, stroking his greasy hair. Sheela helped Drew up. Her mouth was slack and her blue eyes showed relief. She went to say something, but instead hugged him tightly. "I guess the starlust wore off," Drew said. "I thought you'd be dead. Kristen showed me where you'd gone." "Hey, dummy," Kristen said apologetically. "Thanks for coming back." Gurgling laughter rippled from the sloor's smoldering, bubbling carcass. Everyone jumped and Kevin hit it with another blast from his rifle. The sloor didn't move. Sheela, Drew, and the others approached it slowly. Inside the body was a small box. It glowed red and had a speaker from which the laughter emanated. Sheela reached in and picked it up. A string of slime followed. She shook it off and examined the box closer. A scratchy voice said,
"Hello, Sheela. We found you."
"Then come and get me, Shinfar." Sheela tossed the tracker on the floor and stomped on it. The laughter died. "Whoa, that was an astro gremlin?" Missy asked. They're on their way?" Justin wiped green goo off his broken glasses. "But we killed it," Drew said. Sheela sighed and shook her head. The tracker activated earlier when the sloor saw the cruiser. Sheela suddenly grabbed him. "Was I dreaming before? About the journal?" Drew managed a smile. Back in the sky aboard the heavily damaged cruiser, Sheela stood beside Drew as he flew them to the barn. He pushed it, but the engines kept failing, the cabin lights flickered, and wind rushed in through the shattered windshield. "It's like a convertible," Kevin said as Sanetta applied bandages and healing foam to his and others' wounds, wiping them clean of the green blood. Slore blood was toxic and burned their skin. "Where's the gate to the ship?" Justin asked Sheela as she searched the skies ahead of them. Sheela didn't respond, and the rest of the short, rocky flight was quiet with anticipation. Sheela leaned forward, tense, like she might get out and run ahead. The cruiser finally gave out over the cornfield, and everyone held on as they crash-landed 20 yards from the clearing. The poor cruiser hissed, and smoke wheezed out from the rockets as they hustled off. Drew was the last out, and he switched on the Orin wall so that only the smoke was visible. Justin grabbed an extinguisher on his way out and ran to spray the engine. Drew beckoned to him. "Leave it. We won't need her anymore." Instead of running for the doors, Sheela looked at Drew. "The gremlins are on their way. If it's not there, we're finished." Drew pictured his mom as a girl seeing the ship and meeting the strange alien man. He saw her writing it down, sketching it, and later telling the little boy the story. Drew took Sheila's hand. "It's there." He led her forward. They pulled back the doors and passed through the Orin wall into the chaos. Their base was destroyed. The Slore had followed the Tok-Tok scent and ransacked it. Several Tok-Toks were dead. A few lucky ones had hidden in the eaves, shivering miserably until Missy called them down and placed them gently into her backpack. Sheela and Drew flipped over the lab table and cleared the gear away from the floor. They fell to their knees, feeling around the floorboards, the others looking on in confusion. Drew's fingers located the edges of something under a thin layer of hay, and they hurriedly brushed it clean. It was a trap door. It had been at their feet this entire time. Chapter 22. The Ship. "They found it," Ryan whispered. The wooden trapdoor had an iron ring handle on one side. Sheela grabbed and yanked, but the door was constructed of thick planks, and it took all of them to pull it open and push it back. The door fell with a loud crash and kicked up clouds of dust. They coughed and rubbed their eyes as they peered through the haze. A square portal yawned up at them, so dark it appeared black. They crowded around it, shivering from the breath of cold that wafted out. Sheela grabbed a cracked lantern and dove to her stomach. "Anything?" Drew asked. She shook her head and got to her feet. "Let's get some rope," Drew began, but Sheela handed him the lantern, took a breath, and jumped in. Missy screamed. Justin gasped. The others rushed forward to grab her, but Sheela had already disappeared. "Sheela!" Drew called. No answer. "Ryan, help me down." He lay face down and spun so that his legs dangled into the darkness. Ryan clasped his hand, and it felt like he might pull him back out. "Drop me," Drew said. "You sure?" "Yep." Ryan hesitated and then let go. Drew was swallowed by the darkness and fell several feet before feeling smooth, hard-packed dirt at his backside. He slid and flailed his arms, but there was nothing to grab and no way to stop. Then the floor leveled, and he popped out of what had been a tunnel. He still couldn't see, but his other senses told him he was in a large, cavernous chamber. He was sitting on uneven dirt and could feel rocks and roots beneath him. The air smelled of earth and moisture, and dripping water echoed from somewhere. He climbed to his feet, afraid and disoriented. As he started to shout again, he saw a faint light appear in the distance. "Sheela?" He stumbled toward the twinkling star and soon bumped into her. Sheela was holding out the key, and its cold light was growing brighter. As the key brightened, it appeared to activate a blue-white light, like dawn at the chamber's distant edges, and a large silhouette materialized ahead of them. The polar starship rose like a pyramid, Its white metal exterior reflected the growing light. The bottom half sat down within a crater while the topmost deck touched the ceiling. It was a starship, but like the cruiser, it wasn't futuristic. It was an ancient alien obelisk, magical and ethereal. A giant cannon pointed off the stern, the polar cannon that would defeat Malgore's Necrobeast and destroy the Outland Gateway. Screams echoed from behind, and Drew pulled his eyes from the beautiful ship to turn and see the others tumble from the tunnel slide. The screams and laughter stopped when they saw the ship. Sheela was transfixed, and when Drew finally touched her, she jumped. "Isn't it beautiful?" Her eyes shimmered, and she could barely speak. Drew felt numb and smiled so widely every muscle in his face was cramping. The others joined them, and they clung together in a collective stupor. Then the group charged for the ship. Sheela led the way down into the shallow crater. They ran beneath it. Its wide base was well out of reach. They spotted a spiral staircase near one of the great legs and climbed it to a circular hatch. At a small hole to the hatch's left, Sheela used the blue key. She plunged it in and the hatch slid back. Instead of climbing up, the staircase raised up inside. The group lifted into the bows of the great ship and the hatch closed beneath them. The air was close and warm, and light emanated from the walls and ceiling in gradients of orange and purple. They finished climbing the staircase and exited up onto the bottom deck. Sheela led them through a corridor of tan walls with cream-colored conduit. Drew felt like he was deep in the alleyways of some exotic city. The bottom deck was a biodome. A stream bubbled around below the floor and pooled in a lagoon. The plant life was purple and green, and thick vines and other plants grew and glowed across one side of the chamber and ran up the walls and hung from the ceiling. Fungi dotted the landscape. Mushrooms glowed red, yellow, and orange, and Drew realized the interior light wasn't coming from the ship, but the plants. "It's an Aurelian garden," Sheela said. "This is what they eat on long journeys. The plants also clean the air and filter the drinking water." They moved past the garden to a spiral ramp, passing the next deck and going to the one above it. It was dark now, and Sheela used the blue key to light their way. They exited the ramp and stopped in front of two wide doors. She waved the key in front of the doors, and they slid back. They entered a dark room with a low ceiling. Sheela went to the center of the room, her light revealing a console. "Polars with me," she said. Drew was the first there, but everyone gathered around her. She turned to Drew and held out her hand. He was confused until he realized she was handing him the key. She whispered to him, "Dimensions and worlds will be forever in your debt. You will be the keeper of the key. It must never leave you." "Why me?" "Yeah, why him?" Kevin said. "I gave over to despair, but you proved yourself a true liaison and brought us all to this moment. The key is safest with you." Drew took it and inserted it into the hole on the console. "Everyone turn it together," he said. They all took hold of the key and turned. Nothing. And then a low hum built and grew and vibrated up through them. Banging noises from the lower decks startled them. The giant ship woke with creaks and groans. Consoles around the room lit with low blue lights. Panels flickered to life. Conduits glowed. Buttons, switches, dishes, screens all winked and blinked and chattered. Then, in a powerful flash, the entire command center of the polar starship was lit. They all stood at the center of the room on a raised quarterdeck. The consoles and stations all faced a wide, narrow port window. There was a worn leather chair, creased and stained like an old baseball glove. Sheela approached the chair and placed her hand gently at the back. They all looked on, and she caught them watching as she regained her senses. She smiled through shimmering tears. "What are you guys waiting for?" They ran about the command room, finding the same stations they'd been assigned on the cruiser. They found their seats and ran their hands over the dials and switches and wheels and buttons. The ship spoke to them, whispered into them, guided them. Drew stood and watched, soaking in everything until his brain threatened to explode from joy. He felt a weight lift. They were saved. They were going to win this war. They were going to be heroes. Most importantly, he was saved. He was getting out of Warfield. Sheela stood beside him, addressing the crew as they explored their stations. My father taught me about the ship. It has 3 decks and is fully collapsible. It can hyperfold into something not much bigger than the cruiser. My father told me no one knows how old it is or who constructed it, but it has a portal jumping technology no one has ever been able to duplicate. It protected the floating cities of Gladhill, and explorers used it to discover the dimensions of Zoltron and Nestoria. Sheela spoke, but no one listened. They were struck by the ship's captivating beauty and dancing light from the waking systems. They sprinted into the main hallway and down the ramp to the next deck. They found the lab lit with spectral yellow light from the floor. It was full of test tubes, beakers, and strange alien creatures preserved in yellow liquid. Multicolored vines hung from the ceiling and more exotic plants sprouted from the walls and floor. They found the equipment pool stacked high with messy aisles of small vessels, gadgetry, tools, suits, engine parts, weapons, and things for which they had no earthly description. They discovered the medic bay through a hidden entrance off the main hall. It contained 6 pods with glass shells and mattresses made of healing foam. Sheela explained that the lives of many great explorers and warriors had been saved in these 6 pods. Kevin found the mess hall. It was full of foreign fruits, vegetables, meats, and liquids, preserved beneath a layer of mist. Gunnery turrets lined the hallways between stations, and on all 3 decks. They found the barracks on the lowest deck with its armor and rows of laser rifles. These weren't the old boxy models Sheela had stowed in the cruiser. These were smooth, rounded, lightweight, copper-tinted rifles with strips of blue light lining the barrels, just like her snub-nosed pistol. Sheela called them in after a while. I want you to see the sleeping quarters. She took them to a wall on the middle deck. She tapped it several times, and the circular hatch slid back. The rounded, narrow tunnel was just big enough to walk through. It reminded Drew of the large drainage tunnel they rode their bikes through near Watkins Park. You sleep in a tube? Kevin asked. Sheela beckoned them, and they followed single file through a short run, and they came out the other side, into a dark room beneath a wide dome. Sheela touched a panel on the wall. The room came to life, and suddenly they weren't in a room at all. They were standing on a beach, under a red sky. A strange breeze rushed over them, and they looked down the hazy shoreline to see a magnificent city with twinkling spires. The room projected the images so clearly it no longer felt like a room. Sheela said, "You can set this to look like whatever you want, whatever helps you sleep or not miss home so much. My father said he used to come in here and bring up projections of my mother and sit staring at her for hours. He never slept well on long voyages." The others marveled as Sheela changed scenes by touching the pad and imagining different places. The palace chambers of Orel's capital city, the Zoltarian star bridges, the giant cave lagoons of Rexo. Cots were spread around the floor where you could lie down under an alien sky or deep in the jungle city of a faraway world and fall asleep to a gentle breeze. Drew felt himself getting woozy. The room was warm and comfortable like a bath and smelled sweet and calming. His shoulders dropped and his body tingled. The battle with the Slore had clenched him in knots, but now every muscle was loosening and releasing, like he could unravel and fall in a comfortable heap on the floor. He looked around and saw Sonetta stretching out her arms, closing her eyes, and tilting her head as the soft breeze kicked back her hair. Kristen and Missy were leaning their heads on Kevin's shoulders, and Ryan swayed like the breeze might blow him over. He was transfixed by the distant city. Justin was the only one fully alert. He scrubbed his glasses and swished in his windbreaker as he moved about, examining the walls and dome. "How does it work?" he kept muttering. A thought washed hotly down Drew's chest. "This can show you anything you can imagine?" "That's right," Sheela said. The room dimmed as she removed her hand from the pad. She led the group to the command room, but Drew lingered. He turned to follow the others, but then paused. Checking to make sure everyone was gone, he approached the touchpad. He gulped and thought about running from the room. Then he stretched out his hand. and placed it flat against the pad's cool surface before closing his eyes. Even with his eyes closed, he felt the room light up and the air change. He smelled familiar smells. He heard birds chirping. He trembled violently so that his teeth clicked, but he forced his eyes open. It was exactly as he imagined. His room at sunset, the warm red sun casting its last light down over his bed and the mess of clothes and action figures on his floor. He glanced at his dresser and saw the picture. It was propped upright, and, in its reflection, he saw her. He turned slowly, and there she was, leaning against his door jamb, arms crossed comfortably at her chest. She wore the shirt he'd given Sheela, and she smiled at him. Her hair was thick and wavy and beautiful, her eyes bright and full, like she'd never been sick. They didn't speak. She was just a projection of his memory. She just leaned and smiled at him. Drew finally pulled his hand away. He hid himself deep in the equipment pool and pulled himself together by shocking himself on a busted Oran disc. He found the others in the command room. When he entered, Ryan spotted him and grabbed him around the shoulder. "I looked all over for you. I was, exploring." Ryan looked in his eyes. "You okay?" Drew tried not to look away, but his hands were fidgeting. "I'm good." Ryan pulled him over with the others, but kept a tight hand on him. "I got a question," Kevin said, looking up from the wide, colorful comm station. "How the heck do we get this thing out of here? I mean, do we start digging?" Sheela smiled and nodded as though Kevin had read her mind. She went to the captain's station and punched in some coordinates. "Just like you. I've never been here before, but Father told me how it works. Watch this." She pulled back the jumper lever. The kids waited for something to happen, but the ship merely groaned and rattled as lights throughout the halls and rooms flickered. Sheela frowned and tried the code again. A soft alarm beeped from the engine console, and Justin ran to it instinctively. "Report?"
"It says the plasma needs to be mixed before jumping. What does that mean?"
Sheela joined him and checked the message. "This is going to take 2 days. We don't have that time." She kicked the console and hung her head. "Malgore's already sent a detachment of gremlins," she sighed. "Start the mixing." "We're low on fuel?" Drew asked. "The polar plasma that allows us to fly, jump, and defend ourselves has been sitting too long and needs to be mixed. We can't get the ship out from under this barn without jumping. The polar plasma also powers the cannon I'm going to use to destroy Malgore and his ship." "Hey," Drew put a hand on her shoulder. "Malgore still doesn't know we found the ship. We have 2 days. 2 days gives us time to prep, and when those tanks finish mixing, we'll rescue the warriors and give Malgore the surprise of his life." Sheela suddenly hugged him. Her cheek grazed his, and he wrapped his arms around her. He wasn't embarrassed or nervous. In that moment, he felt one with her, knowing the weight of her burdens and the strength of her hope. They held each other tightly as the others gathered around them and joined in. There were no words, only tears and laughter. They eventually exited the ship through the basement hatch. The stairs lowered and the hatch closed. Drew looked up while the others descended the spiral staircase. Something caught his eye, a bit of chicken scratch they'd missed on the way in. He got up closer, and when he saw what it said, he went numb and nearly fell from the staircase. The phrase read, "Mickey Mouse has warts." "Sheela." Drew grabbed her before she was off the stairs. As the others kept going, he pulled her back up the stairs and pointed at the writing. "That was my mom saying. Her password. She was here. She saw the ship." Sheela gently touched the etched writing, marveling at it. "See? It's my destiny to come with you, back to your world. Drew, I need your help as crew. But then you need to come back here. This is your home. You promised. If I found the ship, I could go with you." Sheela looked at the message again, scratched out by a young girl long ago, and nodded. "But if you're leaving for good, you need to tell your father." "I will." Chapter 23. Countdown. Early the next day, Drew was thankful to see the invisible cruiser had stopped smoking. They would need to move it eventually, but for now, it was represented by a smashed section of corn, like a UFO crop circle. He lay awake all night thinking about the Polar, and it called to him so he could think of nothing but boarding it again. They spent the day exploring, prepping, and learning the ship's stations. The seekers used to find the ship were now pointed at the Warfield gateway to alert them the second anything, like a gremlin fleet, broke through. They cleared out the barn and loaded all the gear into the Polar's storage bay. They rounded up all the talks and kept them on board, where the creatures trundled about underfoot and made messes. "Nothing yet," Kristen reported for the 10th time that morning. She nervously chewed on her newly painted nails while she and Sinetta monitored the gateway from her radar for any gremlin activity. The gremlins would arrive in Zool ships, large living organisms the gremlins had converted into ships. The Zools looked like slugs and moved slowly, but their gelatinous flesh was covered in a thick membrane that protected them from small arms fire. They were also dangerous in their own right, able to spit acid goo and use their long spiked tongues to snatch soldiers from 20 feet away and devour them. Justin sweated over the engine diagnostics console, watching the painfully slow mixing process. To distract himself from the oncoming gremlin attack, he frequently snuck off to explore the ship's catacomb-like engine room. Ryan and Missy learned the weapons systems, starting with the ship's giant plasma cannon. Sheela told them the gun's highly concentrated blast of polar plasma would destroy Malgore's nearly indestructible necrobeast in one shot. With Malgore dead, she believed the adults would be freed from the parasite's control, and the gremlins would surrender. Sheela stood tall at the Polar's helm. Even though she barely slept, the dark circles were gone from her eyes. She'd sworn to Drew she wouldn't touch any more Starlust. Now her eyes were fiery and focused, her jaw set. "I've got Bash," Kevin said from his station. Kevin projected Bash in the middle of the room. His transparent form fizzled and waved.
"Hey, sis."
He smiled even while wearing a bloodied headband and his left arm wrapped in a ratty sling. "What's happening?" Sheela said.
Nothing much. They got us pinned deeper in the tunnels."
Bash gripped his rifle tightly with his good hand.
"Good news. Dimension warriors from all 9 dimensions have reported in, but it's getting harder to hide them all, let alone feed them."
"Bash, I lied," Sheela said. "We didn't have the ship, but we do now." They heard the other warriors cheer in the background. Bash chuckled.
"I knew you were lying. I was just hoping you'd actually find it before we all became slore food."
Speaking of, Captain Shipley and his polars killed a slore. It would have killed me, and I would have never found the ship without him. Bash nodded to Drew.
"You did good, liaison."
Sheela smiled. "He's more than a liaison. They're dimension warriors, and he's the keeper of the polar key." Bash hooted, and the others cheered. Drew let his chest swell, showing off the key on the necklace. He was handling this newfound fame quite well, he thought.
"Welcome, brothers and sisters. Life's about to get a whole lot worse. But we're glad to have you."
He looked at Sheela.
"I can't wait to see the ship. Anything you want to tell me?"
Bash, Sheila's eyes shimmered with tears. "It worked. We're mixing the plasma, and then we're coming to rescue you." Bash gave her a look.
"So you're not going to tell me about the gremlin fleet on their way to capture you?"
Sheela snorted. "Minor inconvenience." Bash shook his head.
"No, it's not."
He began to disappear as his signal faded. Sheela lunged to grab her brother, but her hands went through him. "We're coming for you! Barricade yourselves in! We're leaving soon!" His voice cracked through the transmission.
"Be careful. Malgore ain't no. You have the Polar. He'll kill us all. Or hold us hostage. You have to fight the gremlin and take 'em by surprise."
Bash vanished. "What'd he say?" Missy asked. Sheela looked at Drew. "Malgore can't know we have the Polar. He'll hold the warriors hostage or kill them if we get close. If he gets desperate enough, he'll send the human army after us, and we'll be forced to fight our own." Drew saw Sheela spiraling downward with all the horrible possibilities. Hey! Everyone looked at Drew. He went on. We keep radio contact to a minimum, and we don't ever talk about the ship. If the gremlins get here before we take off, we blast them before they have a chance to report back to Malgore. He looked around at the group. Keep learning your stations. We're leaving in less than 48 hours. Suddenly, an alarm sounded, and everyone jumped. The gremlins are here! Missy screamed. Drew's blood turned to ice, and all his confidence evaporated. Chapter 24. The New Girlfriend. Polars, quiet! Sheela ordered. She killed the alarm. Someone tripped one of the sensors outside the barn. Kristen used a seeker dish hidden among the brush by the barn door. It was fitted with a camera. The monitor flickered to life and displayed the clearing and cornfield. Drew couldn't believe it. Steve pushed through the corn stalks and emerged into the clearing, dusting himself off. He had a flashlight aimed up at the barn. It's just my dad, Drew sighed. How did he know we'd be here? Sheela asked. They watched as Steve approached the doors and yanked on them. I locked the barn doors. If we wait, he'll leave. Justin paced nervously. He knows something. He's looking for you, Ryan said to Drew. We're supposed to be spending the night at your house, remember? And we're staying the night at Kristen's, Sonetta said. We all better get our butts back if we don't want to raise suspicion. Sheela was back at the engine station, checking the mixing process. You okay? Yes. Just get back here as soon as you can. Steve jumped when they pulled back the barn doors. Whoa! Wasn't sure if you guys were here. Steve went on to tell them the slore fight put Grimes over the edge. Sheela had coated the slore with acid powder, leaving nothing but a gooey, undefinable blob in the middle of Chuck E. Cheese. But the damage around town and the multiple break-ins at Book Alcove and Safeway, combined with the missing dogs and cats and random trail of green ooze uptown, ignited a panic. Warfield's 2 cops were working overtime to patrol the parks, back alleys, and other secluded areas. They also deputized some good old boys, friends of Willie's, to cruise around in their smoky trucks and make a lot of noise to intimidate who, or whatever, might be terrorizing their town. Kristen got permission to have the girls stay the night. She told her dad she was sad about Cooper, who they were still looking for, and she claimed they needed her friends to help comfort her. She wasn't lying, the tears were real, and her parents agreed. Steve was excited when Drew asked to have Justin, Ryan, and Kevin stay the night. Oh, great! We can have pizza and watch a movie, Steve said. The boys agreed to the pizza, but Drew claimed they were too tired to stay up for the movie. All that work on the tree house wore them out. Drew also invented a new lie, claiming they were now dividing their time between construction and hunting the creature that was eating all the dogs and cats. Steve listened and gave Drew an odd smile. All right, son. Sounds good. I'm proud of you guys. He took a swig of his beer and pointed at them all mid-gulp. There was talk of canceling the carnival this summer, but people complained, and they're going to have it. I saw them setting it up today over at the high school. It's Friday. Steve handed Drew a pink printed sheet of paper advertising the carnival. It's actually kind of mandatory due to the curfew. Sounds like the whole town will be there. The boys feigned excitement with grunts. I know you guys are probably worried about the wolf or weirdo or whatever it is stealing the cats and dogs. The Millers can't even find Cooper, but we'll all be together, and all your parents will be there. The pizza was delivered, but no one had an appetite. The coming Astro Gremlins wore heavily on their minds and stomachs. Kevin ate 2 slices out of pity, and Steve collected up the nearly full boxes, struggling to squeeze them into the fridge. Wow, I would have thought a crew of hard-working boys would be famished. You all trying to lose weight? Yes, sir, Kevin said, slapping his belly. My mom wants me wearing a size 5 before school starts. Well, it'll be our breakfast tomorrow. Unless you guys want Anne's famous pancakes. I taught myself how to make them. I want Drew to try them, but every time I turn around, he's sneaking out the window. They all looked up at Steve as he caught himself. I mean sneaking out the door. And I don't mean sneaking. You guys aren't sneaking anything. You're just going out to work on the treehouse. He sighed. Anyway, get a good night's rest. I'm sure you've got a lot of work to do tomorrow. He awkwardly tousled Drew's hair as the boys headed upstairs. I love you, son. Drew stopped at the bottom of the stairs. His dad's words were slow to sink in, but when they did, they punctured his heart. Drew turned slowly, and his friends waited awkwardly for him to respond. Drew thought it, but he couldn't say it. "Oh, you too, Dad," he muttered. They barged into Drew's room. "Why didn't you say you loved him back?" Ryan said. "It doesn't matter. You're scared to say it. He just said it out of nowhere. I wasn't ready for it. When else would he do it? You're never around." "Wish my dad would say it to me," Kevin said. "Are you going to tell him you're leaving?" Ryan asked. "No. We can't tell anyone. It's top secret." Justin plopped on Drew's bed miserably. "I've been trying not to think about that, but Ryan's right. How do we say goodbye to our parents without them knowing? You won't need to. We'll be gone a few hours, or a day, tops." "You don't know that," Ryan said. Sheela hoisted herself into the window. "When can you all return to the ship? We need to keep prepping and monitoring." They all clammed up, and she narrowed her gaze at Drew. "What?" "Nothing, we're fine," Drew said. "Well, my brother's not. I got a call after you left. The warriors are dug in, and Malgore has him surrounded. He's looking scared, and Bash doesn't scare easily." She reached into the sack she was carrying and brought out handfuls of small wristwatches. "Everyone take one. These bands are set to the ship's radar, and will blink red when the gremlins enter our gate." The team put them on, and Drew looked his over, half expecting it to start blinking. Suddenly, the bedroom door opened, and Sheela pulled her gun. Drew grabbed it from her as his dad peeked in with a laundry basket. "Drew, I have clothes here." "Oh!" Steve looked Sheela up and down, taking in her headband, scar, warrior jacket, and Anne's shirt. "Hey, Dad." "Hi, son. And you are?" He was still looking at Sheela. Drew was trying to remember Sheila's backstory when she cut in. "Stacy, Kristen's cousin from Arizona." Steve frowned. "Stacy? You had blonde hair the last time I saw you." "Yeah, colored it. Trying something new." "Uh-huh." Steve dropped the laundry basket on the bed. "Son, I need to speak with you." Drew followed Steve into the hallway. "Dad, we've been getting together like this to talk about the treehouse." "Stop!" Steve crossed his arms. "What's going on? Why is she wearing your mother's shirt? Why were you going through our closet? Your mother's journals were pulled out." "Dad, what's going on? I thought I could trust you. I thought you were growing up. I wasn't going to say anything, but what's going on?" "She's my girlfriend. That's why I've been sneaking around. I was embarrassed. I was looking through Mom's journals to better understand girls." Drew hated himself more with each lie, but he told himself it was all to protect the old man and Sheela. Steve stepped back and blinked. His hardened expression softened, and he broke into a smile. "Ha! Wow! A girlfriend! Ha! She's really cute, too. Hey, what's with the jacket and the headband? She's really into punk rock?" Lying was too easy once you started. Steve ducked back into Drew's room. "Stacy, sorry about earlier. Drew just told me you guys are going steady, or whatever you call it now." Drew's friends did their best not to laugh, and Sheela played along, even though she had no idea what Steve was talking about. "Yes, we're going steady, and she's leaving to go back to Arizona, so we're trying to spend time together." Steve blushed, giddy. "Good thing you'll have the carnival tomorrow night." Drew shook his head. There was no time to go to the carnival. They needed to prepare. "That would be great, Mr. Shipley." Ryan glanced sideways at Drew, and the two shot each other wide-eyed looks in a silent argument. Steve didn't notice, but was lost in thought. "The carnival was where I took Anne on our first date." He snapped from the memory. "Drew, you and the guys walk Stacy back to Kristen's." Steve approached Sheela, and she tensed, her hand searching for a weapon. Then he reached out to shake. "Stacy, it's nice to see you again." Sheela gulped. Her shoulders loosened. She shook his hand and returned his warm smile. "You too, Mr. Shipley." They went downstairs to the door, and just as they were about to leave, Steve called down, "Stacy, come over for dinner tomorrow, before the carnival. I'll make Anne's recipe." Drew again shook his head. "Dinner? Mom's recipe? Why is Dad putting our mission in jeopardy? And why is he torturing me?" "I'll be there," Sheela said, before Drew could stop her. When they got outside, Drew pulled his hair out. "We don't have time for the carnival or dinner." "I wasn't going to say yes," Sheela said, fighting tears. "But when he shook my hand, I saw my own father." She looked at him. "Drew, you have no idea how lucky you are." She left him and went into the corn. As they walked home, Drew fell behind. He was looking at the stars again, wondering what it would be like to go beyond them. Now that leaving was a reality, doubt crept in. Kevin and Justin had gone on ahead, but Ryan dropped back beside him. I heard what you asked Sheela back at the ship. Drew looked away from the sky and saw Ryan eyeing the chain for the blue key under Drew's shirt. What are you talking about? You're leaving. You... Ryan gulped, and Drew realized he was trying not to cry. You want to leave. Drew didn't need this now, not with his dad telling him he loved him and talking about first dates to carnivals and his mom's recipes. We are all leaving to destroy Malgore and become heroes. No, you don't want to just leave for the fight. You want to leave for good. When we found the ship, I heard you tell Sheela to promise to take you with her. You want to live in her world. A single tear dropped down Ryan's cheek, and it struck Drew that the last time he'd seen his friend cry was kindergarten. Were you even going to tell me? Or were you just going to wave when you dropped us all off? You guys could come visit, and I could come visit you. All 10 dimensions will be safe, and I would come back. What about your dad? You're just going to abandon him? He'll be fine. Really? I wrote him a letter. Wow, a letter. That makes it all better. Ryan turned his hat around and pulled the bill low over his eyes. Every time my dad sees me, he sees my mom, and it makes him sad, and he makes me scared of growing up. I think we'd both be better off with new lives. What's wrong with you, man? What's wrong with me? Everything. Kevin and Justin have each other, and they're good at school. Kevin wants to be a comedian in Kansas. Justin, an aeronautical engineer for NASA. You have your sports teams, and you're gonna go on and do great things. Eventually, you're gonna realize you're cool and I'm just a freak. None of you are afraid to grow up. All of you have goals and a place here. I have no place, and finally something happens and I'm not just Drew Shipley. I'm a pilot and a liaison and a dimension warrior. I don't belong here, Ryan. When I saw my mom's writing on the starship, I knew this was my destiny. Ryan angrily wiped his tears and turned away, heading home. Drew looked down and found he was gripping the blue key in a tight fist. Its soft blue glow creeped through his fingers, and he looked from it to his friend until Ryan disappeared into the darkness. Drew did go home after Kevin and Justin came back for him and asked where Ryan was. Drew lied and said he wasn't feeling well. He didn't know it, but Sheela had been listening, hidden behind a few rows of yellowing corn stalks. Chapter 25, The Last Supper. Drew woke later that night. He was in bed and about to fall back asleep when he saw his mom standing at the foot of his bed. She held the hand of a boy, the younger him. She looked at him with a sad smile and pointed to the corner of his room where his dad sat slumped against the wall. He had his head in one hand and the other clutched a piece of paper. Steve had found his letter. He looked small, like a child. Drew looked past Steve to his doorway, where Ryan's silhouette had appeared, silently waving to him. Drew waved back until he realized Ryan's limp body was being operated like a puppet by a black slore just behind him. Drew heard his mom moan and looked back to see her transforming, her hair falling out, her face caving in, the chemo and cancer doing their terrible work in time-lapse. He heard a giggle and saw the boy holding her hand was no longer him, but the boy Malgore projected. Drew tried to look away, but he couldn't. His terror grew as he saw a figure emerging from the darkness behind her. It filled his room, and its hands reached around her and enveloped her. She melted into the thing behind her. It swallowed and became her. Malgore. He stood at the foot of Drew's bed, putrid and oozing, his deformed face mostly hidden within a red hood. Two small yellow eyes glowed from deep within the hood.
Captain Shipley,
he said, his hot breath washing over Drew's face. Drew opened his eyes. He was staring out at the same dark bedroom. His digital clock showed 3 a.m. He was shaking, and his heart was pounding. He quickly felt for the blue key beneath his pillow, but it wasn't there. Panic struck him and he felt Malgore's hot breath wash over him again. Malgore's here! He took the key! But when he looked up, he saw the breath was just a humid breeze drifting in through his open window. He hurriedly went back for the key and spotted a soft blue light glowing through his bifold closet door. Now he could smell the faint odor of sweat and leather, and he knew what had happened. He went to the closet and found Sheela curled up among his dirty clothes, hunched over Anne's journal. She'd taken the blue key from under his pillow and used it to read. She had the journal flipped to the pages about her father. His sketch rested under her free hand. Drew sighed heavily and tried to shake loose from his nightmare. Malgore felt close, and he wondered if he might meet the creature face to face when he left with Sheela. He reached down and gently took the key from her hand and put it around his neck, hiding it beneath his PJs. Protecting it was his one job, and it wasn't going to leave him again. He wouldn't be going back to sleep, so he went to his desk and used the light of the moon to begin his letter to his dad. He started and crumpled several versions, dropping them into his wastebasket. Dear Dad, by the time you read this, I will be gone. He tried not to look at his mom's picture on the nearby dresser. She had encouraged him to go, with her dying, her journal entry, and her secret code written on the ship. More than that, it was her weirdness, and the way she always urged him to embrace his imagination as she did hers. She made him this way, and his dad had never understood him. It was her fault, yet he could now feel her judging him. He placed the picture face down and finished his letter.
Captain Shipley.
Drew woke at his desk, the pencil stuck to his face. Sheila's voice came over the walkie on his bedside table. The sun peeked above the trees, shining into a now empty closet. He jumped up and grabbed the walkie. Is it gremlins?
Mickey Mouse has warts.
He felt for the key. It was gone from around his neck again. Sheela, stop taking the key. What's going on?
I needed it to boot up the ship. Over and out.
He dressed quickly and ran to the barn. The team was already in the ship, manning the command room and crowded around the maps and navigation station. Drew burst in. What is it? Justin ran to him, practically skipping. The mixers are nearly done. 8 more hours and we're off. 8 hours is still a long time. Why did Sheela use the code? Justin grabbed and dragged Drew to the navigation station. Kristen located the Zul fleet using the Polar's tracking technology. Why is that a good thing? Kristen radioed me at 4 this morning. Sheela put a hand on Kristen's shoulder and squeezed proudly. Who needs beauty sleep? Kristen worked and manipulated the map, spinning and enlarging it. I thought, the map system can't see ships, especially with Orin walls, but it can identify creatures, so I made Justin give me the code for the Zuls, and then I started searching the different dimensions. She looked up at Drew. Pretty good for a blonde, huh? Drew tried to make eye contact with Ryan, but his best friend wouldn't look at him. He tried to focus on the map, fighting a sinking feeling since their argument and his nightmare. The Zul fleet appeared as a collection of red dots within a 3D projection. They shimmered as they crept across the map. But they're getting close, Drew said, pointing to a planet on the map. They're almost to us. They would be, if this were us, Kristen pointed at the Chiron below the map. The Zul fleet was drifting through Zoltar. Okay, what does this mean? The flickering map reflected in Sheila's eyes. Zoltar's big. Zuls are slow. We've calculated their arrival time as late tomorrow. And the mixers will be completed by tonight. Justin was back at the engine console. There are other Zul fleets, right? How do we know this is the closest one? How do we know this is the one headed for us? The rest are currently stationed in Orel, with Malgore or in Torin assaulting the warriors, Sheela said. Kevin moved to the radio console. He hit play on a recording, and a gremlin transmission played back in gremlin language. I locked in on the fleet's transmission and recorded our buddy, Shinfar. Pretty good for a fat kid, huh? He winked at Kristen and she smiled. Sheela turned to Drew, doing up her jacket and tightening her belt and holster as if ready to take off at that moment. I thought we'd be forced to make a stand and fight the gremlins on your turf. She looked at Drew gravely. And we would have lost. Against gremlins? We killed a slore. Drew searched himself for his original exhilaration and tried to emote the confidence he had before, but it wasn't there. Shinfar is the leader of the Morg tribe. They're killers, cold, calculating, and ruthless, and they'll probably have slores and other creatures with them. Shinfar himself has killed some of my best warriors, and I've already told you how dangerous their Zul ships are. But it doesn't matter now. We'll launch well before they get here, destroy them, and rescue the warriors. And strike Malgore's necrobeast before dinner. I'll bring you back before your families even know you were gone." She looked at them proudly. "You will return as heroes, even if no one here knows what you've done." Ryan crossed his arms, grunting and glaring at Drew with a cocked eyebrow. Drew knew he wanted him to confess he was leaving for good, but the others were too absorbed with Sheila's speech to notice the exchange. Ryan went to Sheela, and Drew was sure he was about to announce it himself. "Permission to go organize the armory." "You and Missy already did." "Permission to double-check." "Permission granted." Drew watched him go. Why doesn't Ryan get it? I'll be back. I'll probably have my own ship, and return whenever I want and take them on adventures. But the thought no longer comforted him. He circled the map with his nightmare still clinging to him. Why wouldn't Malgore come here to capture you himself? He doesn't know I have the ship. He thinks I'm scared and alone, and he wants me brought to him. As Drew looked about him, he no longer recognized his friends. They'd become the crew of the polar starship, but somehow he felt confused and small like he had before meeting Sheela. It occurred to him they'd all broken their promises from that night in the cornfield. They'd all grown up. He shuffled around, the only one without a station. "Are you all right, Captain?" Sheela asked. "I'm fine." They practiced their stations throughout the day as more systems came online. The engines pumped the newly mixed polar plasma into the veins of the ship like a giant heart, so that the only system yet to power up was the jumping booster. It also happened to be the most important, as they couldn't go anywhere until it was all powered up. When Missy reported that the polar cannon was operational, everyone cheered. Kevin bumped Missy out of the way, messing with the cannon's controls. "Why wait to jump when we can just blast our way out of here?" "Because it would probably disintegrate half your planet." Sheela had returned from her nap and was checking the mixer progress. Missy punched Drew in the shoulder and crossed her arms. "What is up with you and Ryan? I don't like secrets." "That's 'cause you're a gossip." Drew tried to say it playfully, but it sounded more like an accusation, and Missy returned a sour expression. When he saw the others were listening in and waiting for an answer, he backed away from them. "Everyone have your portal watches?" He held up his right wrist to show them the thin black monitor. "I'm not wearing it. It's ugly," Kristen said. "We don't need 'em anymore." The other girls had ditched theirs. Justin patted him on the shoulder, enjoying the fact that he wasn't the worrywart for once.
"Drew, they're entirely unnecessary. Plus, it inflames my eczema."
He knew they didn't need them. The little watch was to show them when something breached the portal, and that wasn't going to happen, but he kept it on just to spite them. Sheela switched off systems. "Go home, see your families. We'll rendezvous at your carnival before leaving." They powered down the ship but for the mixers and left. Drew placed the key around his neck and squeezed it for reassurance. It wouldn't leave his neck until they left. As they walked out of the barn, Drew gazed up at the peach-colored sky. He was headed for the great beyond. He finally felt his heart lift, the way it had before, but the thought was interrupted when something pricked his thigh. He reached into his pocket and his heart sank. He pulled out a folded piece of notebook paper. His letter. He would slip it into his dad's briefcase tonight. The idea of seeing his dad was suddenly terrifying. "How did your father react to your decision?" Drew was startled to see Sheela beside him. She'd quickly changed into some Earth Girl clothes from Kristen. "What are you doing?" She gave him a funny look. "Your father invited me to go with you to the carnival, remember? I wasn't going to come, but now that we know about the Zul fleet... Anyway, how did your father react? Did he bless it right away, or did it take convincing?" "My decision... Oh, he was fine." "So he knows my true identity?" Drew gulped and wiped a sudden sheen of sweat from his forehead. "He knows I can come back and visit." She reached up and pushed his lips into an artificial smile. "I can see why you remind him of your mother. You look like her." Drew thought, "Wait, did I tell her how Dad gets sad because I look like my mom?" But Sheela was already walking away, so he shook the thought and followed her. That had been the reason. Somehow he'd forgotten. His dad was sad and resentful when he saw Drew, but he wasn't anymore. They came to the edge of the cornfield with the sinking sun at their backs. "Look, maybe this isn't a good idea, the carnival. It might be better for you to wait on the ship. Your father requested I come, but if you want time alone with him, I understand." Drew was relieved when Sheela began to turn, and then, "Stacy! Drew!" His dad stood at the back sliding door. "Ready to go?" Drew's heart sank. But as long as they headed straight for the carnival, he could make it through this evening without either Steve or Sheela catching him in his lie. "You're shaking," Sheela said. She grabbed him and shook him firmly, staring her cobalt galaxy eyes into his. "We did it, Drew. This is going to work." I know, Drew said. He wasn't thinking about gremlins at that moment. He looked ahead at his little yellow split-level house and dilapidated deck as the sun painted the discolored siding orange. "Let's go," he said, planning to take her straight into the garage. But when they squeezed inside the sliding door, Drew jolted to a stop. The dining room was neat and the table set for dinner with his mom's china. There were glasses of water with actual ice, sweat from the cold water collecting around the glasses and dripping down the sides. There were napkins folded and silverware laid out. There was a cut-up baguette and a bowl of peas. The table hadn't looked this way since, well, before his mom got sick. "I thought we'd have dinner before we go," Steve said as he exited the kitchen wearing oven mitts and carrying a steaming casserole and a glass baking dish. He placed the dish down and surveyed the table with pride. "What is this?" Drew said in dismay. "Dinner, I think." Steve glanced doubtfully at the casserole. "I tried to follow your mom's recipe." He looked at Sheela and smiled. "I'm glad you're here." He came over and pulled out her chair. Sheela sat and he scooted her in. Drew sat across from Sheela and Steve stood at the head of the table, blushing. "Mind if I say grace?" Drew paused with a piece of bread halfway to his mouth. "Sure," he managed. "Please," Sheela said. She followed Steve's lead, folding her hands and bowing her head. Steve cleared his throat. "Lord, I haven't talked to you in a while. Anne always did this. She's probably laughing at me right now. I thank you for Drew, and for Stacy, and for new life. Oh, and tell Anne I can't wait to see her again. Amen." Drew swallowed and crunched his teeth together, holding tears back at gunpoint. He started eating the bread midway through the prayer. The spongy yeast helped push back against the lump in his throat. He hadn't closed his eyes either, but watched as tears squeezed through Steve's closed eyes. They dropped away from his bowed head and hit the carpet with audible thuds. Steve opened his red eyes and cleared his throat again. "Let's eat." "This is good." Drew wasn't sure if it was, but he shoveled it in as he glanced at the clock. His foot bounced below the table. Steve sat and slowly made his plate. Sheela wolfed down the home-cooked meal. She'd eaten mostly snacks and cold leftovers since arriving in 10. "I'm sorry you're leaving, Stacy," Steve said. "Somehow I feel like I know you." "I feel the same, Mr. Shipley." "Steve. Call me Steve." "Steve." "Drew and I are really going to miss you," Steve said. "But I want you two to keep in touch." Sheela paused and shifted a hard glare at Drew, chewing a hunk of her bread angrily. Drew looked at his plate. "Uh-oh, I used to get that look from Anne. Did I say something wrong?" Steve asked. Sheela looked back at Steve and softened. "No, of course not. You just reminded us of something we haven't done yet." "Will you be back?" "I hope so. This is so good. This was Mrs. Shipley's recipe?" Drew wasn't hungry, but eating was an excuse to stay quiet. "Yeah, this was Drew's favorite, although not after tonight," Steve chuckled. They both looked at Drew. "Drew, anything to add?" Sheela asked pointedly. "Nope," Drew responded through a mouthful of casserole. She looked back at Steve. "Mr. Shipley, I'd like to know more about Drew. He's a student of others, but reveals little about himself." Steve chuckled again. "If he's not going to say anything, he leaves us no choice." "What was he like as a little boy?" Drew got up and started clearing dishes even before Steve and Sheela were done. He took a stack of plates to the sink. He turned on the hot water and began scrubbing. The blue key hung heavy on his neck. Steve sat back. "He was adventurous. Never knew where he was half the time. I guess Anne always knew because she was the one giving him the ideas. She told him and his friends stories about ghosts and monsters that roamed the woods and the cornfield and the barn. She told them if they could brave those things, there were amazing treasures to be found out there. She drew them maps and hid little prizes for them to find." Steve trailed off. "I actually don't remember much. I was working a lot and traveling. It was really just the two of them." "That was admirable of you, providing for your family. My father traveled a lot, months at a time, but he did it for us." "What does he do?" Sheela looked away. He works far away. Well, I'm sure your parents can't wait to see you. When do you think you'll come back? Sheela looked back at Drew between sips of water. I don't know. I'd like to think soon, but I'm thinking it may be a very long time. Oh, Steve tried not to look at Drew. Maybe you two can be pen pals or chat on the phone. We have your number, right? Sheela nodded and looked back at Drew. He was engulfed in a cloud of steam, washing the same dishes over and over. What else about Drew? Sheela said. Steve thought and laughed. He used to bring home animals, wounded ones that needed help. He was so worried about them. He and Anne would bandage them and try to make them comfortable in a shoebox or something. I would come home and find mice, moles, squirrels, frogs, and salamanders in shoeboxes all over the house. He would stay up all night with them, check their water and food, and make sure they were warm. Steve sighed. I remember getting so angry. You remember that, Drew? I hope not. I used to yell at you to go to bed. Biggest fights Ann and I ever got into were Drew caring for these stupid animals. He's a good caretaker, Sheela said. Drew came out of the kitchen and checked the clock. And when they died, Steve continued, he was crushed. He cried for days. I think he thought he'd failed them, and it was too painful. Anne would make me quietly go out and bury them because Drew didn't want to let them go. She told me once it was because he didn't know how to say goodbye. The room, the house, the world grew uncomfortably quiet and small. The old clock in the living room chimed. When Anne got sick, Steve said. Drew started telling jokes and goofing off, leaving doors and windows open and curtains drawn back. He played loud music, destroyed my records, he played them so much. He created treasure hunts for Anne in the house and made her stay up late so they could tell each other stories. Made me so mad because he was distracting her from getting better. The silence between words was deafening. Steve's voice was tight, like he was being choked. I now know. He was trying to save her. Steve sniffed and took a sip of water with a shaking hand. And he's been running ever since. Steve looked at Drew. You didn't fail her, bud. I failed you. And I'm sorry. There's nothing to be sorry for. Drew's mouth moved before he knew what he was saying. He couldn't look his dad in the eye. He couldn't look at Sheela either. After another moment, Drew managed, We should probably get going. As they got up and went for the door, he fell behind. He quickly removed the letter and slipped it into his dad's jacket pocket. He'd read it 100 times. It was a terrible letter. Dear Dad, if you're reading this, I'm already gone. Please don't be sad, blah, 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 blah. The summer carnival glowed neon under the darkening sky. Screams and the clanging and banging of rickety rides echoed across town, and the air smelled of deep-fried dough, cotton candy, and cigarette smoke. Sheela and Steve talked on the short car ride. He shared about his first date with Anne at this carnival, and how he, the cool jock, had wanted to break it off because she was a nerd. Steve pointed to the Ferris wheel. We got stuck on that very Ferris wheel, and she confessed she was done with the date because I wasn't interesting enough for her. As they got out of the car and walked toward the carnival, Drew noticed Sheela was quiet. He finally met her eyes, and she no longer appeared angry. She was lost in thought. The other Polars arrived, trickling in with their families. Drew and Sheela watched as they hugged their parents and said their goodbyes. Their parents had no idea the goodbyes were real. You're just riding the scrambler. Why are you crying, Miss Sinetta? Sinetta's mom asked. She cupped her daughter's face. Drew saw Ryan hug Big Jake. Jake seemed caught off guard, but hugged him back. Deputy Grimes manned the gate. He nodded at Drew with a hardened blank expression. As Drew observed the looming cop, he felt a compulsion and broke from the group. He went to Grimes, with everyone gawking. Sir, he said. What do you want, kid? Grimes looked down at Drew from under the low brim of his hat. I just wanted to say, I'm sorry you haven't found your brother. I'm sure that's been hard on you. Grimes' broad jaw slackened and his face twitched. Thanks for protecting us. Drew started to walk away. Shipley, Grimes called out. Drew turned. Just be careful out there. Drew waved and returned to his friends. He led them deep into the carnival, and there they were, the baseball team, the pool kids, their teachers, and the old men who sat outside Pete's barber shop. The whole town they were now fighting to protect. Drew called them into a huddle. "All right, everyone's seen us. Set your watches and split up. We'll meet behind the Ferris wheel in an hour. Do not be late." They dispersed. Kristen, Missy, and Sonetta were swarmed by all the friends they'd ignored the entire summer. Kevin forced Justin on board the flying saucer ride. Ryan's baseball team found him, all of them wearing their Warfield Huskies ball caps. "You've got to try some funnel cake," Steve told Sheela as he led her to a nearby food stand. Drew was alone, taking it all in, when he noticed the big boys. They watched him from a distance. Jimmy wasn't with them. Drew smiled to himself. They used to be so big. As he turned, he came face to face with Jimmy. The once handsome, horrifying bully now had sunken cheeks and dark circles beneath his eyes. He looked at Drew as if they were the only two people on Earth. "There he is." Jimmy lunged at him, and the two of them went to the ground. Jimmy was still quick, grabbing Drew from behind in his sleeper hold. Jimmy squeezed, but Drew's fear and guilt, everything he'd felt that evening, exploded. Before he could think, he sent several hard elbows into Jimmy's ribs and wrenched himself free. Jimmy fell and curled up, gasping. Drew leapt to his feet and raised his fists, but Jimmy looked up from the dust and smiled, blinking as his breath returned. The burst of adrenaline died away, and Drew lowered his hand to help Jimmy up. Jimmy chuckled and spat. He grabbed Drew's hand and Drew hoisted him up. "You win. At least we got the tree fort, right?" And with that, Jimmy saluted and left him behind the hot dog stand. Drew dusted himself off and looked around. No one had seen the scuffle. It felt like a strange closure to Jimmy Griffin, but a neighborhood bully was no match for a Dimension warrior. Drew left the shadows to find Sheela and Steve eating a funnel cake, white powder coating their mouths as they pulled apart the fried dough. "Where have you been?" Steve asked. "Just waiting," Drew said. "Drew, why don't you take Stacy on the Ferris wheel?" Steve said with a wry smile. "She doesn't want to." "That's a good idea, Mr. Shipley," Sheela said. She grabbed Drew by the arm and dragged him toward the Ferris wheel. Drew checked his watch. "I think we should go back." "How do you say it in Dimension 10? "Oh yeah, shut up, Drew." Kristen had clearly rubbed off on her. They stood in a short line to the Ferris wheel, Sheela still gripping his arm. As he looked at the line, Drew awkwardly realized only couples rode the Ferris wheel. Teenagers and some adults stood holding hands, whispering to each other, resting against each other and staring into each other's eyes. "Take my hand," Sheela said. "What?" She'd also observed the protocol. Drew finally reached out and found her hand. They struggled to get the right hold before she intertwined her fingers with his. Drew whispered, "I can explain about not telling my dad." "Wait until we're on board," she said. She rested her head on his shoulder to mimic the other couples. The line of lovers moved, and finally Drew and Sheela were ushered into a red gondola. It whooshed away from the ramp, out and upward. "I wrote Dad a letter, but it wasn't coming out right, so I rewrote it 100 times. You're not coming with me." Her voice was calm, and she turned her body toward him. "Wait, what?" "Sheela, you promised!" Drew felt his stomach drop as they crested the glowing wheel. Uptown Warfield sparkled on the horizon, and the night sky was clear above them, but neither was taking in the view. Neither saw the mountainous thunderhead approaching from the south, invisible against the darkening sky, even with the angry flashes deep within. She looked into him. "Your dad loves you. He reminds me of my own. You're leaving because you think it's better where I come from." "Sheela, shut up. You lost your mom. But you still have your dad, and your friends, and this world. I had friends like yours too. If you come with me, you'll lose everything, and you have no idea what that's like." She sniffled and took his hand. "I want you to listen carefully, and I've already decided, so don't try to change my mind. I'm leaving you all here." Drew went numb. "I'm taking the Polar beyond your gate, and I'm going to seal off the door to Dimension 10 for good. The Polar's cannon can destroy gateways. It's the only way to ensure your world stays safe." Drew tried to pull away from her. He had no idea he was crying. She held onto his hand and pulled back. "Hey!" Drew shouted. Some of the couples in the gondolas to the front and back glanced at them. Drew lowered to a hushed yell. "You promised me I could leave. You want that because you think my world is better, but it's not. I'm your second in command." Sheela shook her head as a tear ran down past her pink scar. "No, you're just a kid." She leaned in and kissed him. Her lips were soft, and when they brushed his, the lights from the Ferris wheel glowed brightly, and his body floated upward. Drew felt himself press into her and kiss her back. They kissed as the gondola gently ascended the Ferris wheel's back curve, and their lips parted as it slowed to a stop. As the gondola parked, a fat carny wearing a sweat-stained trucker hat and a Margaritaville tank top undid the chain and beckoned them out. Drew stumbled off with his legs numb and wobbly. Sheela grabbed and steadied him. She was right, and he knew it. But even as an immense weight lifted from his shoulders, he fathomed not seeing her again and shook his head. "Sheela, I'm still going." "Drew?" That was goodbye. Drew wiped the tears away, his heart burning and pumping pain into his veins. The two stood speechless. "Hey," the trucker carny called out. Drew looked back at him, and the man pointed to his wrist. "Your watch is blinking." Drew and Sheela looked down. The gate sensor on Drew's wrist flashed red. "Oh no," Drew whispered. "This can't be happening. They're not coming till tomorrow, right?" Sheela looked up at the sky. "It's not possible." Thunder rolled over her words. "Maybe the sensor's broken." But it blinked faster and faster. The gremlins were here. "Drew, we need to go now." Drew jumped up on a nearby picnic table and waved. Ryan saw him and broke from his team, grabbing Kevin and Justin as he passed them. Sonetta tapped Drew on the shoulder. She and Missy had been waiting. Missy was smiling and pointed at the Ferris wheel. "Kissing." Sheela yanked Kristen away from some older boys trying to win her a teddy bear. "Guys!" Drew flashed his wrist and everyone's eyes bulged. "We have to get back to the ship, now!" "It's gonna take us forever to run back," Ryan said. Sonetta huffed. "We should have brought the dang cruiser." "What are we gonna do?" Justin grabbed his face, pulling his cheeks in panic. "What's up?" Steve approached. From his expression, he'd noticed their sudden erratic behavior. "Dad, we need a ride." Chapter 26. Gremlins. "So, you left Kevin's mom's stereo in the treehouse?" Steve asked. "That's right, and it's gonna get soaked in this thunderstorm," Drew said. "And that's why you all had to come?" The others were piled into the back of Steve's tiny Celica, like it was some kind of clown car. They sat on top of each other, anxiously scanning the darkening sky. Sheela was squeezed in beside Drew in the front seat. They came upon the big boys, riding their bikes up Sweepstakes Avenue and heading toward Drew's neighborhood. Jimmy was in the lead, and swerved his bike so Steve was forced to veer into the other lane. As they passed, Jimmy looked right into the car, right into Drew's eyes, and he smiled. It wasn't Jimmy's normal sadistic smile. It was a hateful joy, and his dark eyes twinkled as if he were harboring some terrible secret. The other big boys gave them the bird as they drove on. "I see Jimmy's still a fine young man," Steve said, shaking his head. "Came from a good family. What a shame." Drew could feel Sheela shaking. She bit her lip and wore a cold, focused expression. "We need to go to the barn." She sounded like the general she really was, not the girlfriend from Arizona. "The barn?" Steve frowned in confusion. "Isn't the treehouse out closer to the creek?" "Dad, just take us up Pal's Run to the old driveway." Steve took the old one-lane road and pulled up the long gravel driveway. Drew saw the cruiser lying in the field right where he'd crashed it. Its oren wall had failed, and it lay in plain sight but for the dusk and the oncoming storm. Steve was so preoccupied with the bizarre situation he didn't spot it. Once in the clearing, the kids spilled out the two open doors, and Kevin climbed out the hatchback and flopped onto the ground. "Stacy, it was nice to meet you," Steve called out. Sheela was already headed for the barn, but stopped and came back. "It was nice meeting you, Mr. Steve." She was so flustered she forgot to shake his hand, and instead pulled him into the Aurelian embrace, going up on tiptoe to touch her forehead to his. Then she set off at a run and charged into the barn. Steve looked at Drew, desperately perplexed. Ryan grabbed Drew and whispered, "This is serious. We need to tell your dad what's going on." "Affirmative." Justin hopped about. "Drew, we're in a lot of trouble here," Kevin said. Sonetta said, "You heard what Sheela said about making a stand and fighting the gremlins here?" Missy was shoving sticks of gum into her mouth as she and Sonetta clung to Kristen. They all circled around him, tugging and pulling on him and speaking loudly enough for Steve to hear over the rising wind. "Polars, relax. We stick to the plan. We still have the starship, and they haven't landed yet. Now follow Sheela and get to your stations." He shoved them all forward. "Son?" Drew had forgotten Steve was there. He stopped and turned back as the others ran into the barn. His dad held a piece of paper. His letter. "Oh no, Dad, don't worry. I'm not leaving." "What is this? What's going on? Were you gonna run away with Stacy?" Steve was pale and blinking in the wind. "Dad, I'll explain everything. I swear on the hair. Mom started something many years ago, and I've gotta finish it." Steve shook his head angrily. "What? You're gonna have to trust me." A guttural moan carried above the wind and thunder. Like the night Sheela crashed, Drew felt static electricity as the hair on his arms stood up. Steve's car headlights flickered and went out. Steve and Drew were in darkness when a sickly green spotlight came slanting downward from the thunderhead, hunting over the corn until it located them like actors on a stage. "Dad, run!" Suddenly, a powerful downdraft sent Steve and Drew flying. Drew hit the barn wall and fell. He looked up to see a fleet of dark masses swimming out from the thunderhead like great sharks. He couldn't make out any details, but the sight petrified him. He forced himself up and rushed to his dad. Steve lay beneath the tree line, where he'd been knocked cold. Drew hurriedly checked his pulse. "Dad, wake up!" Then hands were on him, yanking him back. "Dad!" Drew screamed. "He'll be okay. The mixers are done. We must take off and fight back," Sheela yelled. "Your whole world depends on it!" Sheela and Drew leapt down into the trapdoor, sliding and then running. The great polar starship stood ready, and Drew felt a surge of adrenaline as he climbed up the stairs, up through the hull and the bottom decks until he flung himself heaving into the command room. The semicircle room felt hazy, lit only by the ghostly running lights from the floor. The others were at their stations. Just being back in the ship helped Drew regain control again. Sheela took the helm. "Let's get in the air and take out that fleet." "How did they get here so fast?" Kristen kicked her radar station. "It's okay, Chris," Ryan said. "No, it's not. This is my fault," she screamed. Drew ran around in front of the consoles. "Hey, we'll deal with this later. Stations, report in." "Morph jump is ready and Orin wall is on," Justin said. "Navigation is set for the Tauran dimension," Kristen called. "Medic bay and supplies are ready," Sonetta said. "Communications ready," Kevin screamed. Drew's heart quickened. He wasn't scared. He felt excited, confident, and something else. Worried for his dad. He loved his dad. And he loved his stupid little town, and the old men, and Grimes and the Jimmy Cone, and it suddenly occurred to him, I have a place in this world, and I must defend it. "General," Drew said, turning to Sheela, "we can take them whenever you're ready. I preset our jumping coordinates. We'll appear right behind them. We jump on my mark." Sheela held up a hand, waited for a 5 count, and then dropped it. "All right, this is what we trained for," Drew called out. "Commence polar startup." Drew went for the key around his neck, but his hands felt nothing. His hand spidered down inside his chest. The blue key wasn't there. He rifled through his jacket as Sheela stepped away from the helm. "Captain Shipley?" Panic tinged her voice. "Commence startup." Commencing, Drew said absently as he finished checking through the last of his pockets. Drew turned to the crew. Everyone looked at him in confusion. "I don't have it," he heard himself say. "Drew, we can't fly the Polar without it," Sheela whispered. His mind raced. He had it on him ever since the Slore attack, felt for it every few seconds. It was always with him. He swore to guard it with his life. He never took it off. He was about to rip his own head apart to look for it. Sheela and Sonetta raced for him, tearing through his jacket while the others hunched anxiously at their stations. Suddenly, the whole story flashed before Drew. Sheela giving him the key after the Slore attack, watching over it, sleeping with it, showering with it, feeling for it, living by its soft, reassuring light. When had that light gone out? He felt it before the Ferris wheel. Jimmy's voice suddenly whispered in his head, "You win. At least we got the tree fort." Jimmy saw the key. He stalked Drew and saw him fiddling with it. He heard them discussing it. Jimmy didn't know what it was, but he knew it was important. He wasn't trying to fight Drew. "Jimmy's got it," Drew exhaled. His brain did backflips and raced ahead of itself. "Change of plan. Everyone to fallback positions." Sheela went scarlet red. "No, I'm relieving you of command. I know where Jimmy is. Please trust me." "Bad time for a stroll, Drew," Kevin said. Drew turned to leave. "Everyone stay here. I'm going after Jimmy." Ryan tried to block him. "Don't do this." Drew patted his shoulder. "I'm not leaving with Sheela, but I do need to leave now. I screwed this up. I need to fix it." Sheela grabbed a rifle off the wall. She was headed for the door when Drew spun on her. "What are you doing? Stay here." She looked back. "Astro gremlins are about to overrun your town. You get that key. I'm gonna protect Warfield." Kristen joined her without hesitation, and the two of them left the room. The others looked back and forth, petrified, from Drew to the empty doorway, before running and clumsily grabbing laser rifles off the wall. "Guys, please don't go out there," Drew said. None of them listened. Then Drew saw Justin. His friend still sat at the pilot console, shaking so badly his teeth were chattering and tears were streaming down his face. "I'm sorry, Drew. I can't move." Justin was soaked in sweat and looked like he might faint. He had hit his limit. "Are you okay?" "Nope," he sobbed softly. "We're all gonna die." Justin was right. "It's okay, Jus. Stay here. We'll be back." Drew left the room and heard Justin pound the console in hopeless anger. Drew chased after the others, out of the ship to the surface and through the trap door. His head was swimming as he climbed up into the barn and found them huddled in the darkness. Lightning flashed between the warped planks, and thunder rattled the loose floorboards. They bumped into each other in the dark and clustered at the doors. Their hoverbikes and the hover couch leaned against the wall just outside. Sheela and Kristen slowly pulled back the door, and they all peered out. It was dark, but for the distant fireworks from the carnival. Sheela beckoned them to follow. They got low and hustled across the clearing to the corn. "Kevin's shoulders," Drew said, and climbed up Kevin's back. He looked out to the cruiser. He could just make out the ship 20 yards off, its back rising above the stalks like some great beast. They heard two deep moans, like whale calls, and then a flash of lightning revealed them, big as jumbo jets, descending silently just above the cruiser. Two squirming, slimy Zool ships. They looked like fat larvae with no faces, just puckered mouths full of teeth. Tiny arms sprouted randomly off their sides, and spikes covered their bellies. Small rockets, surgically implanted along the Zool's sides, spurted and fired blue flames as they landed. Chapter 27, The Battle of Warfield. The Zools crunched the corn stalks beneath their girth. There was a gooey, crackling sound, and green light poured out from orifices on the Zools' chests, open hatches glowing through the corn with pale green light. The night, with all its bugs and birds and thunder, was suddenly quiet, as if all the earth recognized it had been violated. Drew squinted through the darkness, straining to hear, unable to move against the deafening weight of the silence. He nearly broke his brain listening. He felt asleep in dread. Then the soft crunch of dirt, and the shivers of dry corn husks woke him. Things were moving out there, and they were getting closer. A flash of lightning revealed them. Hunched, misshapen silhouettes crawling over the cruiser's exoskeleton like vulture apes. Sheela had described their standard weapons, so Drew recognized them. Red death lights shone on their razor cannons, and green glowing orb grenades hung off their tattered web gear. Sharp long particle spears and jagged cutlasses jutted off their backs like insectoid antennae. One gremlin, leading the pack, picked along the roof, peering down through the cockpit windshield and aiming its razor cannon. A soft cabin light lit its grotesque face.
Sheela, Govers.
"They're telling me to surrender," Sheela whispered. "They're all over the cruiser," Drew whispered down to them. And it wasn't just gremlins. Drew saw several slores and other creatures. He tried to get a better look at the gremlins circling the cruiser, but his elbow slipped and dug into Kevin's neck. Kevin squealed in pain and nearly dropped him. When Drew looked again, the gremlins were gone. Oh no. A green orb suddenly flew up from the corn. It arced over them like one of Ryan's home runs and exploded the rusted cupola on top of the barn. Everyone watched as green glowing goo melted the cupola instantly in a bubbling glop that ran down the roof. Drew toppled from Kevin's shoulders and landed on Ryan. As his friend helped him up, Sheela grabbed him. "We need to split up and distract them. You go for Jimmy." Before Drew could respond, Sheela screamed, "Fire!" Blue lasers zipped from their barrels across the darkness, exploding against the dirt and the cruiser in showers of sparks. The blast struck the Zulus, their slick flesh absorbing the plasma. They fired their guns so long they ran low on polar charge, and Sheela held up a hand. They ceased fire and their guns hummed as wisps of smoke danced off the barrels. The bright lasers had temporarily blacked out Drew's vision, but he could hear his friends' shallow, quivering breaths. "Did we win?" Kevin whispered. Then they heard hissing and the snap-crack of breaking stalks. "Here they come!" Sheela yelled. Staccato thuds rumbled across the field as the gremlins returned fire with their razor cannons. Red balls of plasma hurtled toward them. The bloody, pulsing light revealed an advancing platoon. Everyone screamed and dove into the dirt. The red burning balls soared over their heads, only to punch holes in the barn and blast through the other side. Sheela leapt to her knees and took aim. Blue lasers zipped from her barrel. The muzzle flashes flickered in her wild eyes, and her body jumped from the rhythmic recoil. Drew found himself too scared to get up. Those red plasma balls had burned real, smoldering holes in the barn. What would they do to him? The others were also petrified, still crouching in the weeds as Sheela swept her gun back and forth, fanning lasers over the field and slowing the advancing gremlins. She nudged him. "They're on the move. They're gonna pin us down." Drew looked up. His eyes had adjusted and he saw shifting shapes racing toward them through the corn. Sheela said, "Drew, we need that key. How are we gonna find Jimmy?" Drew looked back at the hoverbikes and couch. "I think I know. Everyone grab a bike, split up into 2 groups, and retreat into the woods. We gotta keep them away from the town, but double back to the polar." Then he screamed, "Covering fire!" And he blasted the field. When the charging gremlins ducked, the others were forced to retreat to the barn. They frantically grabbed their hoverbikes. Drew grabbed his as Sheela dove onto the couch Missy was pulling behind her bike. They shoved off toward the woods as Ryan, Sonetta, Kristen, and Kevin headed off in the opposite direction to Pal's Run. Drew's heart raced. He was alive, awake, and terrified as he pumped his pedals. It grew eerily quiet until all he could hear was their labored breathing, the hum of their hoverbikes, and the old couch as they soared along the field's edge. Sheela lay facing backwards, stretched out on her stomach, rifle resting on the arm of the couch. Then Drew heard a cacophony of pops as a light show erupted, the field filled with red glowing projectiles, exploding orbs of acid goo, and their own blue lasers. The orbs erupted, spraying the surrounding corn and causing it to hiss and steam. An explosion boomed along Pal's Run. Drew looked back over his shoulder. Smoke rose from the ditch along the narrow road. He saw the hoverbikes glowing quickly across the horizon. The red balls of death were launching into the woods and at the road. "Ha, you're not catching them now," he whispered. Then he saw it. 2 groups of gremlins catapulting from the corn on black, chariot-like hovercraft. They soared 2 to a craft far above the field, howling and shrieking like demons. On each vehicle, one piloted while the other discharged an onboard gutter gun. Lasers rained down like neon rainbows. The gremlin craft were faster than the hoverbikes. The smoldering field emptied and the true chase was on. The polars returned their blue fire. They would be caught soon. This was it. Drew swerved, leading his team into the field. More red plasma balls zoomed around them. Sickening rot filled his nostrils, and green steam burned his eyes as it rose from where the acid grenades had eaten patches of corn and left pale, dead earth. Dry leaves and husks slapped his face as he mowed down the stalks. Drew's squad burst from the corn into the woods. "Follow me!" he screamed as red balls zoomed past them and struck the trees. Drew found the narrow bike path as everyone fell in behind. He heard Sheela's laser rifle spitting back at the incoming gremlin craft. Drew dodged the trees and ducked branches. They jumped the creek and split up, weaving down the many paths that descended the hill. The 5 gremlin craft closed in, flames spurting from their black boosters. Their cackles echoed through the woods. The trees hadn't slowed them, but they did just what Drew had hoped. They dropped down onto the trail right behind the polars. Drew pumped his legs harder. "Everyone duck!" he screamed. The squad lowered their heads as they passed beneath the invisible fishing line secured between the 2 giant poplars across a 20-foot area. Their old trap, set for the big boys. Drew looked back in time to see the pilot of the lead gremlin hovercraft lose his head. It popped off so suddenly, the gunner was still screaming instructions as purple blood spurted from the pilot's headless neck. The hovercraft drifted into a tree and exploded. 2 other gremlin ships hit the wire at the base of their carriages, and the gremlins went soaring through the air, hitting trees with disgusting crunches. The 2 rear gremlin craft slowed, one flying above, the other low, as their drivers ducked behind the protection of the black armored carriages. The remaining gremlin vessels swept in from either side, their pilots cursing in guttural gremlin language. The gremlin gunners unloaded, and red lasers lit up the woods, leaving an erratic pattern of tiny fires along the forest floor. The polars returned blue lasers, shooting over their shoulders. They pedaled hard, gasping for breath, as they tried to keep ahead of the gremlins without smashing into any trees. One gremlin gunner yanked out a jagged black cutlass and jumped from his carriage. He landed on top of Sheela. The couch dipped and hit the ground, jerking Missy's bike so that she nearly went over the handlebars. The gremlin wagged its long, forked tongue in Sheila's face as it brought down the cutlass. She blocked the blade with her pistol and pushed back. Drew aimed but couldn't pull the trigger, afraid he'd hit her. He felt heat as a volley of lasers zipped past his head. Before the gremlin's blade plunged into Sheila's eye, she ripped an acid grenade from the gremlin's vest and stuffed it in its mouth. Its sharp teeth punctured the orb, and the gremlin shrieked. It smacked Sheela with the hilt of its blade, knocking her out as it fell off the couch and melted into a steaming pile of glop. Sheela lay on the hovering couch as if sleeping. The other craft dropped down behind them, blowing out the back half of the couch and setting the rest of it ablaze. Sheela lay unconscious, dangling off the hovering furniture as the flames lapped her boots and legs. The gremlin craft shot and hit the back plate of Missy's body armor. She screamed through gritted teeth. Drew's shots flew wildly, and his gun started overheating. The gremlins were nearly on them when they hurled an acid grenade at Sheela. It struck her but didn't explode, the green orb churning and swelling about to detonate. Then Drew looked ahead and saw the great leaning sycamore, the one ready to fall. He banked sharply, slamming the flaming couch and nearly knocking Sheela over the edge. He snatched the acid grenade as a milky substance seeped out, searing his hand. He screamed and flung it ahead of them. It struck the base of the tree and erupted, engulfing the wide trunk in a rancid, pale mist. Drew grabbed Sheela off the couch as the tree came down on top of them. It slammed the earth, sending up a torrent of mud and leaves before catching the last bit of couch. Missy went flying as Drew and Sheela hurtled into a thick patch of honeysuckle. Both gremlin hovercraft tried to pull back, but had accelerated too fast and slammed into the trunk, exploding. Drew found Sheela in the underbrush as Missy limped over to join them. "Missy, are you okay?" Yeah, Drew, I'm dandy. Her sarcasm had survived the fight so far. Sheela suddenly sprang up, grabbing them both as if to keep fighting. Sheela! Drew steadied her. We're good. She blinked and shook her foggy head. What the? They all looked up to see Billy and the big boys crouching behind the tree fort, peering out in shock. Jimmy wasn't with them. Drew ran wildly at the gang. He yanked Billy out of hiding. Where's Jimmy? Billy, who looked paler than usual, stammered. What was all that? Drew felt his anxiety rising as he pulled Billy close. Billy, where is Jimmy? He saw Billy's eyes travel up over his shoulder and heard Missy scream. Drew turned to see Jimmy behind him just before Jimmy hit him in the head with the butt of an old shotgun. Drew hit the ground and lost his gun. He heard a click-clack. We've been waiting. I'm taking you to Grimes. Drew shook his head, but his vision was still blurry. Where's the key? It's a key. What's it for? Jimmy said. Sheela and Missy went for their guns. Hold it! Jimmy blinked and shuddered. His trigger finger looked itchy. They heard the boom of the distant fireworks at the carnival and the thunder as the wind picked up. Missy spat out her gum and raised her laser rifle. Give him the key, Jimmy! Sheela looked Jimmy dead in the eye. Boy, you have no idea what you're doing. You're about to destroy your world. Ryan and the others zoomed in from the south. We lost him! Ryan shouted before seeing Jimmy's gun. They jumped off their bikes. Back! Jimmy shrieked as the other big boys crawled away out of the line of fire. Drew glanced at the crazed bully. Jimmy, we need that key, now! The key powers a spaceship, doesn't it? The corners of Jimmy's mouth curled up with amusement. That's it. You're aliens. And now you just want to go home. You abducted Willie and took all those animals and tracked slime all over town. He got a wild look. Always knew you were an alien, Drew. My parents always said that about your mom, too. And if you're aliens, it's my civic duty to shoot you. Drew! Sheela dove over him as Jimmy was squeezing the trigger. Then a clicking sound rippled through the dense canopy of trees. They heard a tapping and creaking of branches and hissing. Drew recognized the sounds even before Sheela whispered in his ear. Slores. We're out of time, Sheela said. They're here. The big boys looked at each other, terrified. Jimmy's insane smile waned. What was that? Drew got up. The real aliens, jackass! Brandon, a broad-shouldered maniac and the largest of the group, was hiding in the honeysuckle when something big and cloaked by the dense leaves scaled down the vines and yanked him beneath the foliage. They followed his screams as he was hoisted all the way back into the treetops. Then his screams stopped. One of his shoes fell out of the darkness beside Jimmy with a thud. The polars raised their guns, backing into a tight formation as they peered into the dark canopy. They couldn't see anything, but things were moving up there, crawling around and clicking in horrid wheezes. Brandon! Jimmy raised his shotgun and blasted buckshot over his head. He spun on the polars. What was that? What took Brandon? The big boys, Billy and Tyler, took off at a run. Guys, no! Drew called after them. He saw glowing eyes further up the path. The gremlins were moving in. Then Billy and Tyler screamed out and were gone. A tortured moan filled the silence, and Drew could just make out a Zool ship lowering over the trees, its giant sucker head slithering down and searching for them. The pale, sickly green light seeped down through the branches. The spotlight moved, throwing shadowy patterns over the forest floor and centering on them. Jimmy dropped his gun in shock, and Drew shoved him hard against the tree. The key! Now! Sheets of rain started pouring from the sky. Jimmy stared upward, his mouth unhinged and eyes fluttering. It's... Drew saw the key glowing from Jimmy's pocket and dug it out, but before he could shove it in his own pocket, Sheela snatched it away. I'll keep this, she said, shoving the key into her jacket. What are those things? Jimmy asked. Drew looked him right in the face. Come with us if you want to live. He looked back at Sheela. Let's go. It's too late, Sheela said. At that moment, the forest went red. With howls and cackles, the gremlins opened fire with their razor cannons and gutter guns. Red plasma balls hurtled through the trees, smashing trunks and branches and erupting in sparks. The polars went to the ground as Drew tackled Jimmy. "Stay down!" Drew fired back over Jimmy's head. The polars were surrounded and pinned down by the constant barrage of artillery. The slores, Drew counted 4, crept down the trees toward them. "Ryan, shoot at the trees!" Sheela ordered. "Missy, concentrate on the gremlins!" But it was no use. Ryan's lasers bounced off the slore shells and ricocheted back at the huddled group, striking Kevin in the chest. He fell onto his back, grimacing as his breastplate smoked. "Kevin, I'm sorry!" Ryan pleaded. "We surrender!" Jimmy yelled. "Jimmy, don't!" Drew tried to hold on, but Jimmy fought him off in a panic and stood. Suddenly, a gleaming purple tongue shot down from the Zool, its faceless head poking through the treetops. It caught Jimmy by the leg and upended him. He clawed the earth, sobbing as the polars reached for him. Drew grabbed his hand, but not before he was yanked upward. Drew was shaken loose as the Zool slurped Jimmy into its puckered mouth. The polars opened fire on the Zool, but its thick skin absorbed the lasers, which did no more damage than if the polars were tickling it. "We gotta get out of here," Drew yelled. But they had nowhere to go. Ryan grabbed him. "Drew, I'm sorry. I shouldn't have gotten angry." Drew hugged him. "It's okay." What would happen now? Would the gremlins attack Warfield and release the parasites? Would his dad ever find his body, or would slores carry him off? What would death feel like? How slow would it be? The gremlins and slores closed in, and the polars were forced to drop their weapons. They grabbed and held each other. Drew closed his eyes. Chapter 28, General Shinfar. As the rain pounded down, lightning flashed again and again, followed by gremlin shrieks. Drew opened his eyes. The lightning wasn't lightning. Blue lasers whizzed down from the sky. The gremlins were no longer advancing on them, but retreating into their hovercraft, and the slores were climbing back into the trees. The Zool drifted above them, with its terrible head lowered, when suddenly a flying object collided with it. The Zool groaned, jetting backward, but its head was trapped in a tangle of vines. It snapped branches and uprooted trees as it reared back. The flying object was the cruiser. Drew couldn't believe it. He had never seen a more beautiful hunk of metal. Drew and the others cheered as Justin lowered the ship into the top of the large box elder tree. He got stuck in its thick limbs and screamed through the shattered windshield. "Climb up!" The polars hurriedly scaled the tree. "Hey, Justin! You finally got your treehouse!" The side hatch opened and the group scrambled on board. Drew brought up the rear, returning fire at gremlin hovercraft and slores climbing after them. The ship lurched and nearly took off without him. Drew jumped in, hearing rain and gremlin artillery striking the exterior. The ship was murky from wisps of smoke emerging from the engine room, and it smelled of burning circuitry. It creaked and shuddered as Ryan and Missy loaded into their turrets. Sheela stood at the front with Justin as rain fell through the gaping cracks in the windshield. The others fired their rifles through open hatches. Gremlins and slores dove on top of the ship. They shot inside and swung swords and claws through the cabin. "Hold on!" Sheela threw them into a barrel roll, shaking off the creatures clinging to the outside, while the crew inside grabbed hold of rigging. The gun turrets blazed. The gremlins returned fire, but were scattered, sparking and exploding as the blue lasers struck them. The cruiser rose above the woods as the gremlins regrouped and swarmed overhead in their hovercraft. They dove at the cruiser, hurling acid grenades and firing gutter guns. Drew grabbed Justin, but all he could manage to say was, "How? I chased you guys, but you were gone, and the gremlins had followed you. Then it dawned on me. The cruiser was just lying there." Missy dove in and kissed him before yelling, "You saved us, Jus!" Justin puffed up and then spotted sparks in the engine room. "Kevin, help me back here." Justin was limping, his leg was bloody from the battle. "You need a medic, little buddy." "Engines first." The two of them grabbed tool vests off the wall and charged into the tight rear compartment. Drew passed Missy, who had grabbed the dual triggers and was swiveling herself in a 360 spin, unleashing lasers into the oncoming gremlin craft. Drew climbed up to the front, pulling Sonetta with him. He forced Sheela out of the pilot's seat. Drew took the flight controls as raindrops stung his eyes, and everyone rocked and fell as he banked sharply over the woods. He looked back and saw Sonetta patching a burn on Sheila's shoulder. "I told you I'm fine." "Girlfriend, sit your butt down," Sonetta ordered. Kristen helped hold Sheela against the wall, while Sonetta hit her with healing foam and pasted on a bandage. Drew took them down into a sprawling neighborhood. They flew along the empty streets, with the gremlins chasing them. Missy and Ryan cheered as they picked off gremlin ships one by one. "We're almost to the Polar. We'll be back in business." The gremlins buzzed around them, dodging cars and hacking the tops off the mailboxes with their blades. A few gremlins sprang from their hovercraft, black daggers in their teeth like pirates. Drew heard them hit the roof and scurry about. One peeked its ugly face in the broken windshield and took aim with its hand cannon. Drew shot it. Other gremlins banked in front of him, shooting back at them. Drew pulled back, but the cruiser's engine was damaged. The ship was losing power. "Justin, engine status!" Justin and Kevin emerged from the smoky engine room, hacking. "Getting there!" Justin stole Sonetta's healing foam and used it to put out a tiny fire. They navigated the neighborhoods and flew past Uptown. Far above, more Zools had detached from Shinfar's mother Zool ship and chased them, unloading gremlins on 4- and 2-seater hovercraft. They switched on their Orin walls and disappeared. "I don't understand." Sheela leaned in beside him, her breaths raspy and labored. "They shouldn't have Orin technology, and they should never have been able to get here so fast. Turn on our Orin. We won't see them otherwise." Drew switched on the Orin, and the Zools and hovercraft came back into view through the windshield. The laser blasts would look like lightning to anyone returning home from the carnival. They soared over town and out over the woods. The Gladhill barn was right in front of them, but the cruiser's engines were failing. Alarms went off as one booster died. The ship shuddered violently. "We're almost there!" Drew yelled as he fought the controls. Then the great mother slug ship lowered right in front of them, blocking their path. "Call coming in," Kevin said from the comm station. He answered, and a life-sized projected gremlin wearing a red helmet with horns appeared in the cabin. Sonetta screamed and sprayed the image with foam.
Sheela, Tala crawl.
The gremlin general growled. "No, Shinfar, you surrender to me," Sheela said. The gremlin shrieked and swung at her with a large, misshapen blade. The projection went through her. Sheela shot the comm station with her pistol, killing Shinfar's projection. Drew flew around the slug mothership as it spat glowing goo from orifices along its body. "I can't get around it," he said, rolling away from the slug. It blocked their path, and the cruiser's damaged engines meant he couldn't outmaneuver it. Their guns didn't have any effect. The beast ship's thick, slimy skin easily snuffed out the blue lasers and plasma. "How much fuel do we have left?" Sheela said. "A big gulp's worth," Drew said, switching off alarms for multiple system failures. Sheela squeezed his shoulder. "Punch through it." "What?" "Lasers are ineffective against the outer membrane, but the skin is soft. Aim for the head. It's the command center." "Have you done that before?" Yeah, sure." He looked at her, and she grimaced back. "Liar," he said. She squeezed his shoulder again. Drew took a breath. "Justin, route all auxiliary power to Engine 2. Everyone brace for impact." Ryan climbed up, and Missy dropped down as they dove for their seats. Everyone held on. Sheela twisted her right hand around some rigging and gripped it. Drew shoved the throttle forward and punched the thrusters. The cruiser launched forward, and Drew was thrown back in his seat as they hurtled toward the slug. They hit it, and the cabin filled with sparks and blown circuitry. Drew fell forward against the controls. Warm slime splashed over his face, and purple, red, and green entrails filled the cabin through the broken window. They burst into the red-lit main command room. Drew saw Shinfar's horrid face for one moment. His gremlin's snake eyes bulging and razor-toothed mouth gaping before they smashed into him and his crew. More entrails and hot slime. The cruiser pitched forward. Drew left his seat and hung in the air before slamming back down across the dash as they hit solid earth. Chapter 29. Malgore. Drew found himself on the floor, wedged between the seat and dash controls. He pulled himself out and crawled to his feet. The cabin was dark. "Everyone okay?" he called. His voice, hoarse and broken, didn't sound like his own. In the silence, Kevin said, "Can we go home now?" This was followed by weary grunts and moans. Justin turned on a lantern, and the Polars emerged from the chaotic dark cabin as if they'd been spelunking. Sheela got up off the floor and looked around hurriedly. "That worked? I wasn't sure if the impact velocity against the Zul's membrane would kill us." She wiped slime on her jacket and yanked a laser rifle off the wall. "Come on, we're not done." The others sifted through the mess of supplies on the floor, grabbing rifles and whatever pieces of body armor were visible. They stumbled from the smoldering ship. Sheela and Drew looked at each other, covered in multicolored entrails and dirt. "You look good," Drew said, and Sheela returned a wry smile. Her hair slicked up from the slug ship's snotty membrane. "Is everyone okay?" Drew turned back to the crew. They looked rough, but everyone gave the thumbs up. He could hardly distinguish between them, except for Kevin. They heard a groan, like a distorted whale call, and looked up. The wounded beast undulated its mortally wounded body upward into the sky, retreating for the gate. With Shinfar and the Gremlin crew dead inside, the creature was making its own decision. The other Zuls followed it. "The creature ships are running back to Malgore. We need to destroy them before they escape and warn him," Sheela yelled. "To the Polar!" Drew ordered. They ran for the barn, for the ship. "Let's blow these suckers out of the sky!" Drew screamed. His body pumped with adrenaline as he ran. They made it to the doors. Not the way he'd planned it, but this was going to work. Drew pulled back one door and began to enter, when Kevin grabbed him and yanked him back. "Watch out!" Kevin yelled. They all looked up. A white ship dropped from the sky directly above them. They retreated into the corn, just as it crushed the barn's roof and landed in the clearing. Drew sat up from where Kevin had dragged him. They were hidden among what few corn stalks were still standing. The white ship, a sleek jet-looking vessel with inlaid gold along the fuselage, steamed. Then a hatch opened on its side. "Who is that?" Drew said. "Let's run for the barn." Sheela shook her head. She stared at the ship with recognition. "We're gonna take these out first. Everyone ready to fire?" They took aim as a gremlin platoon spilled down the gangway. They saw not only gremlins, but vivisected creatures with insect jaws, snake eyes, and robotic appendages. Eels, ghostly creatures that drifted about on the wind. Space pirates, and other mercenary types in furs and horned helmets, toting twisted black guns. A black slore descended the ramp. It hunched, bigger and fatter than any Drew had seen. It had deep red, spiraled etchings and patterns carved across its body. Even at this distance, Drew could hear its low, guttural growl from beneath the bulbous abdomen, and its hydraulic-sounding hiss, spraying steaming saliva through its razor teeth. Its entire exoskeleton flexed and shuddered with anticipation. They hadn't seen the kids, and looked around at the alien environment, the barn and corn. "Fire on my command," Sheela growled. Everyone readied themselves, their guns humming. Drew aimed for the slore's lower half. The Polars' combined firepower and ambush might give them the edge they needed. Drew squeezed the trigger, but before he could fire, Sheela suddenly tackled him and pinned him to the ground. "Hold your fire," she whispered. The others froze, fingers hugging the triggers. "What are you doing?" Then Drew followed her gaze and saw what she'd seen. His heart stopped. A man exited the ship and descended the gangplank. Drew recognized him from the many projections he'd looked through on the cruiser. Sheila's father, Mason. He was handsome and dressed in a white uniform. He peered out into the darkness. "Sheela?" he called, his voice deep and kind. Drew heard cackles behind them and looked back to see a squad of gremlin hovercraft landing in the cornfield. "Sheela, we're surrounded. We need to shoot our way out now." Hold on, I'm thinking." Sheela knew it. Her moment of indecision had cost them. They were finished. "There's no time!" Drew took her by the shoulders, and she blinked at him like a frightened child. "You cannot be captured. You're the only hope." Even as Drew squeezed her tighter, he felt her slipping through his fingers like water. She focused on him a moment. "Drew, I'm not the only hope, but if I stay, we'll all die," she whispered. "Stay here. You're not going out there," Drew said. The other polars looked at Drew to do something. Her father called out, "Sheela? Where are you?" Drew went numb. It was all over. His brain tried to understand as it cycled through blame, guilt, and disbelief. They were about to be captured, tortured, and hauled away to Malgore. Sheela said, "Drew, look at me. Captain Shipley?" Her voice sounded far away. Hopelessness dulled his senses. He gazed out at the cornfield, his eyes dim and ears crackling. Sheela grabbed him by the collar and forced him to make eye contact. "Stay here and don't make a sound." "Wait," he clutched at her. "Where are you going?" "Just keep the others quiet and don't come out. You must swear to keep the ship hidden." "What?" She yanked him. "Swear!" Unable to speak, Drew nodded and blinked. Sheela released him. The fierce blue storm in her eyes calmed and a tear fell. She placed her forehead to his, hugged him tightly, and released him. She looked back at the others for a moment as they all clutched each other, petrified. With her rifle slung over her shoulder, she got to her knees and crawled away along the row of corn. A moment later, as her father and the creature horde looked on, Sheela emerged from the corn. She had her laser rifle raised, aiming it at her father. He saw her and smiled warmly. The gremlins and other creatures encircled her. "Sheela, my love," her father said, smiling. "You can drop the rifle." "So that's how the gremlins got here so fast. That's why they have Orin technology. You gave it to them. The gremlins would have taken ages to get here without my help. And I wanted to see you. Promise me you'll take me and leave," Sheela said in a quivering voice. Her hands shook as she advanced. The rifle was trained on his chest. "I promise, my love." Her father stepped off the gangplank and strode to her. She faltered and slowly lowered her rifle. Drew was frozen. The man with the plan, always with an idea or a way out, was completely at a loss. Worse, the fear he thought he'd overcome swallowed him in black panic. He could feel the others looking at him, but he had nothing. Sheila's father came up to her without hesitation. He never broke eye contact, never looked at her rifle. His eyes were deep azure, almost black. His hair blew gently in the exhaust from the ship. She looked exactly like him. Drew saw Sheila's shoulders drop. Her body was limp, and the hardened warrior was gone. She was a little girl seeing her father for the first time in a long time. All else had been an act. He came so close, her rifle's short barrel pressed against his chest. He gently moved the rifle aside and embraced her. She fell into his arms. Drew could barely hear the man's low voice. "My darling, I've missed you so much." He caressed the back of her head as she dropped her rifle in the dirt. Then her father looked up and out at the field. "Did you have a liaison or make friends here?" "No, I paid mercenaries, but they betrayed me and retreated. There's nothing here." He looked down at her as she pulled her head from his chest. He cupped her face. "My darling, where is the polar starship?" "Don't you know, Father? You're the one who hid it." The man's smile faded a bit. "That I did, but I can't remember." He stroked her cheek. "If you give me that ship, all the wrongs will be forgiven, and you and your dimension warriors will be free." Sheela paused. Drew watched her quiver before him. I haven't found it." Sheela stepped away from her father. He twitched and cocked his head. His jaw slackened, and when he spoke again, his voice was high and inhuman.
Give it to us, my child.
I don't have it, Malgore. The man smacked his lips, and his tongue flicked. His carefully brushed hair fell out of place.
You must know where it is.
It's not here. He sighed, glanced back, and nodded. The Slore sprang into action. It scuttled at Sheela and grabbed her up in its claws. The demon platoon cheered with cackles and howls as the Slore choked her and stretched her arms and legs, pulling her into the shape of an X. Sheela screamed in pain. Drew lunged forward, ready to shoot, when the panic and dread took hold of his gut, and he froze. He looked out at Sheela, her body held fast and stretched like a rag doll. He felt himself shrinking. He saw his mom in the hospital bed, gritting her teeth against pain and nausea, fighting to live just long enough to see him. He'd run then, when his dad had taken him to say goodbye. Even when she'd reached for him and tried to smile like everything was okay, he couldn't say it. He'd been too afraid of her pain, and terrified of the final goodbye. He couldn't save her. Retreat was the only option. He would never get that chance to say goodbye. He dropped the laser rifle and crawled backward like a frightened animal. As the Slore stretched her, Sheila's father looked up at her and smiled warmly. Do we know where the ship is now? Her breath came sharp and quick as she moaned against the pain.
No,
she gasped. Her father sighed again. The gremlins growled and hissed at her, flicking their forked tongues and playing with their twisted knives. Her father stiffened and twitched.
Your brother's base will soon fall. Where is the polar?
Sheela looked down at him hopelessly.
I never found it.
Let us search out this dimension, her father called to his troops. Sheela spat down on him. The Slore stretched her further and she screamed.
There's nothing here but useless humans.
It doesn't mean the ship isn't here.
If I had the ship, I would have used it to destroy you.
But I know where it is. And Bash and the other warriors will stand down if I order them to. I'm the key to finding the ship and ending the war. Malgore looked hungrily at her from her father's eyes.
Yes, Sheela. And I'm very eager to meet you.
Let us go, child. You will do all of those things. He looked at a nearby gremlin.
Collect the dead and their vessels. Leave nothing for the scavengers.
The polars shivered and wept, holding each other as the Slore carried Sheela aboard the ship. The ship lifted off, smashing through the remaining walls of the Gladhill barn. It rose higher and disappeared in a twinkle as it passed through the gate. The Zulus disappeared in orange shrouds and traveled quickly around, collecting dead gremlins and hovercraft. Sheela was gone. The others lay there in the mud, stunned as the rain died away. But Drew had run. He'd left his weapon and fled. Chapter 30. First Day of School. The first day of school was abuzz with excitement. Everyone was talking about their summer. The luckiest kids had gone to Disney World, while most of the others ended up at Ocean City, at sleepaway camps or on dreaded road trips to visit grandparents. There had been sleepovers, pool parties, fist fights, and summer romances, but nothing out of the ordinary. There was still some talk of the tornado, even though they only saw the after effects. City officials and weather experts said a massive EF4 tornado with winds up to 166 miles per hour must have touched down just to the west of Warfield the first night of the carnival. Strangely, it only destroyed some mailboxes before ripping through a cornfield and the old Gladhill barn. Much stranger were the blackened scorch marks along Mary Street. Some older residents said they saw lightning strike the street and some trees. One man claimed the lightning was so close and flashed so brightly it temporarily blinded him. The important thing was that no one had been injured. Or so they thought. Jimmy Griffin and 3 of the big boys had been missing since that night, last seen leaving the carnival at 7 o'clock. The gossip among the kids was that Jimmy and the others had run away. Some said he and the others might have been swept up by the same tornado that smashed weird, erratic patterns throughout the Gladhill cornfield. Police discovered one of Jimmy's Converse shoes hanging from a branch out in the woods. Besides that, they found no trace of the boys. So the curfew was still on, and anyone with information was encouraged to contact a tip hotline. After Sheela was taken, the Polars scattered and hunkered down in fear. But Sheila's father and the gremlins and Slors hadn't returned, and nothing dropped from the gateway in the sky. A group of convicts picking up trash along Route 108 did find a strange piece of twisted black metal thought to be a gun. It was evaluated by some authorities and tossed in Wiley's junkyard when they couldn't determine what it was. Wiley's was now under new management. The Polar starship still lay buried deep below Warfield, under the remains of the Gladhill barn. The group, once referred to as the Polars, had no key to power it, even if they'd wanted to. So, as helpless, stupid kids, they fled to their homes. They all had sleepless nights and night terrors and acted strangely. After a few weeks, the town acted as if nothing had ever happened, but the kids were broken. They couldn't find their way back to childhood now. Missy started hanging out with friends she'd neglected during the summer and chewed more gum than usual. Sonetta volunteered to help in her mom's small law office, stapling depositions and shredding old documents. Kevin developed a stutter and shut himself in his room, listening to comedy records until his parents threatened therapy. Justin hid away, rebuilding his giant Rube Goldberg erector set catapult. Kristen went with her family to their beach house in the Outer Banks, as they did every year, and would return the second week of school. Ryan started baseball and went to the gym every day. He shot free throws late every night on their driveway until his dad came out. Ryan wouldn't stop shooting even when called, and often had to be tapped on the shoulder. He jumped every time. Steve had woken up in the field, questioning his memory of what happened. The tornado sounded better than everything else he remembered, and no one else had seen anything. So instead of thinking he was crazy, he accepted the EF4 story. Drew Shipley was in hiding. Ryan would knock and ask for him, and Steve would shake his head and shrug. Every time, Steve asked, "What happened that night? Did Stacy get off okay?" Ryan would shake his head, shrug, and leave. He even gathered Kevin and Justin a few times and stood in the backyard below Drew's room, tossing twigs at his window. His shade was drawn, and Drew never pulled it back. They tried calling him on Justin's walkie, but there was nothing but static. So it was weird to see Drew the first week of school. He drifted in quietly. He wore a faint smile and didn't talk to anyone. Ryan tried to stop him, but Drew slipped in and out of classes too quickly. At the end of every school day, Ryan looked for him, but Drew was gone. Kevin and Justin didn't have any luck either. Drew was a ghost. Drew felt wonderful. His mind was clear and full of sunsets and bronzed clouds and pirate ships. He'd been reading Peter Pan and comic books as well as watching cartoons. He spent time playing with action figures, stretched out on his stained oval braided rug, the one his mom had in her room growing up. Sometimes he drew treasure maps of the woods and cornfield, the places his mom used to call weird space. He no longer had a problem remembering her. To help him imagine weird space, he paced about his room, wiggling a pen or pencil. He knew it looked strange, but he'd done it since he was little. Once lost in his imagination, Drew could pace and wiggle for hours. He kept his door shut so his dad wouldn't see him. But sometimes, at the end of the day, Drew began to feel weird. His heart quickened. He broke into a cold sweat, and his stomach did flips and threatened to toss his dinner. Drew would pause from TV, or wiggling, or comic books, and sneak to the black stuffed monkey on his bed, the one his mom had bought him at Toys R Us. The monkey had a small rip at the back of its neck, where a bit of white stuffing often stuck out. Drew would reach in and feel around where a leather pouch of shiny black pills was hidden inside. He knew to fish one out, and he knew to take only one for some reason, having the faint concern that they would eventually run out. In another moment, he would feel right as rain. Right as rain? What does that mean? He thought that every time before diving back down to the oval rug to read. One night, Drew was perched on the tan toilet in the upstairs hallway bathroom. He'd been there a while, somewhat constipated and prairie dogging a large bowel movement. The hum of the old ceiling fan, beige walls, and the warm light from the fixture over the sink had mesmerized him, and he sat thinking comfortably about life. Suddenly, his heart began racing, and a cold sweat broke out over his face. He forced himself to poop, wiped the blood from his butt, and ran for his room. He froze in the doorway. A boy wearing a basketball jersey stood in his bedroom. The window sat half open with a gentle breeze blowing in the curtain. The boy stood by his bed, holding up the old stuffed monkey. In his other hand, he held up the pouch. Drew eyed the pills. His brain screamed for them. "This is what Sheela was taking, wasn't it?" the boy said. "Who?" Drew had no idea who he was talking about. The boy nodded, finally understanding. "So, they make you forget. Give 'em back, Rye. Drew struggled with the name. "You don't remember me either, huh? Just give 'em back." "No, you don't get to forget. Not if I have to remember. I'm not letting you do this again. I need my friend back." Drew lost himself and rushed at Ryan. They crashed into the end table, smashed the lamp, and fell to the floor. Drew fought for the pills, but Ryan crushed the remaining 20 in his hand. A wispy black powder blew away in a sudden billowing breeze. "No!" Drew screamed. He spun and punched the side of Ryan's face, but Ryan didn't defend himself or retaliate. A moment later, Steve hoisted Drew up and pulled him off Ryan. "Drew!" Steve shouted, wrestling Drew back. Ryan got up, his basketball jersey torn and a red mark blushing below his left eye. He'd have a black eye for the next week and say he got it from a stray baseball. He looked at Drew another moment and left through the door. Drew fought back against his dad. Steve wrestled him to the bed and shoved him down. "Drew, what is going on?" "Nothing. Something," Steve said as Drew glared up at him. "Is this about Stacy going back home?" "Who?" Steve sighed angrily. "Or was it about this?" He yanked a piece of paper from his pocket and opened it. Drew didn't recognize the paper. "Dear Dad," Steve read, "by the time you read this, I will be gone. Please don't look for me or call the police. You won't find me. I'm helping do something important, and I think I'm where I'm supposed to be. I want you to go on and live your life and start a new family." Tears filled Steve's eyes, and he gulped. "I'm sorry about Mom, and I'm sorry I wasn't a better son. I love you.
and I hope I will see you again someday." He tossed the letter at Drew. "Why would you ever think I would want a new family? You remind me of her, and I love that." Her. Drew saw a silhouette in his mind, but it wasn't Anne. It was her. Sheela. "Please don't, Dad. Where were you going?" Drew sank to the floor. Steve crawled down beside him and put an arm around him as he wept. "I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry," Drew said through tears. He could barely breathe, and with each gasp for air, he saw her more clearly. Dark blue eyes, wild black hair, pink scar, smile, her gaze, like she was looking into his soul. Drew had failed her, like he'd failed his mom, his dad, and his friends. The memories returned and crushed him under the weight of pain, guilt, and sadness. Steve wrenched Drew back from the precipice. He held him tightly for a long time as they cried together. Drew woke up. His face hurt from crying, and his throat stung. Steve was still asleep, curled up on the floor beside him. Drew's letter lay nearby. He remembered writing it. He remembered it all now, and he thought about her. She eclipsed everything in his mind. He watched her betrayed by her father and taken away over and over, dragged off by the slore. He could do nothing to save her. He remembered running. His heart still burned. His brain locked in the dark. No ideas, no way out, and nowhere to run. He sat there in the deafening silence, surrounded by his horrible thoughts, with Sheila's scream echoing from far away. He had to move or run, otherwise he would lose his mind. Then Drew had an unthinkable thought, to do something he'd been determined never to do. He got up quietly, so as not to wake Steve. He snuck to his closet and uncovered his Dimension Warrior jacket buried beneath clothes and books. The jacket still smelled faintly of acid grenades and smoke as he put it on. He left his house when it was still dark outside and walked across town. He didn't look at the cornfield or rubble where the barn once stood. The area was still roped off due to safety concerns. He passed through the woods and emerged behind the old Presbyterian church as dawn lit the horizon. He heard the distant whoosh of morning rush hour traffic on the highway and saw blankets of dew on the grass. He entered the graveyard at the back of the church and went to her grave in the far right corner. He stood over it. He was no longer afraid of her or of this place. He knew she wasn't there. This hadn't been the end of the road for Anne Shipley. "I'm sorry," he whispered into the morning. The graveyard quieted his thoughts. He looked up and whispered, "What do I do now?" He stood a while, waiting for an audible voice, for his mom or an angel or God to open the morning clouds and speak to him. The only response was a cool breeze to remind him the summer was over. He didn't know what he thought would happen, but it wasn't going to. He turned to walk away and shoved his hands in his pockets and felt something. He froze, feeling the object with his fingers. Then he slowly pulled it out. The blue key glowed in his hand. He stared at it, expecting it to disappear, but it remained. This is a dream. This can't be real. I've lost my mind. I'm hallucinating. He turned the object over and over in his hand, and then looked up for that break in the clouds, in case his mom had tossed it down to him. Sheela took it from him. It was on her when they took her. Her hug. All at once, he remembered Sheela had grabbed him before sacrificing herself. She'd given him the key. Chapter 31. Mickey Mouse Has Warts. The church basketball league had a short season, starting at the end of summer and ending in the fall. All 6 teams played out of the same dusty old gym connected to the Methodist Church on Klein. After the competitive summer sports like baseball, this was just for fun. Even Big Jake relaxed, sitting in the stands to talk and laugh loudly with his friends. The players weren't all that good, and the coaches and refs were volunteers. People from the community used it as an excuse to visit with each other while waiting for high school sports to start. But at this evening's game, Ryan Wilcox charged up and down the court, stealing the ball and rushing it back for layups. He was flushed and sweat-soaked. His torn jersey and his shiner made him look scary. His coach and the refs joked about him needing to slow down and take it easy. "He's still upset about blowing the baseball season," Jake quipped with others in the stands. His team was confused, collectively deciding to stay out of Ryan's way. He scored 24 of his team's 26 points, and that was only because another kid on his team had been fouled. Ryan had not missed a shot. "Pass the ball, Ryan," Big Jake shouted from the stands. Where was this during baseball? His coach prepared to take him out, readying the substitute off the bench. The other team grew timid, passing the ball quickly before the demon Wilcox bore down on them to block their path. Ryan stole the ball again and was fouled when one of the other players got fed up and shoved him. He didn't react but went to the line, not taking his eyes off the basket. Swish. He hit the first. He readied himself for the second when there he was. Drew stood just behind the pole of the basketball hoop. He wasn't smiling or waving or angry or sad. He was just there, watching. The two stared at each other. Ryan glared at Drew before wiping the sweat on his forearm. He shook his head, dribbled, and took the shot. It missed by a mile, falling 3 feet short of the basket. Justin was in his unfinished basement, perched at his dad's workbench, below the migraine-inducing fluorescent light. He was using his dad's soldering gun on the same radio he'd taken apart and put back together 5 times. The exercise made him feel better at first, but had begun to remind him of repairs he'd wanted to do on the cruiser. Something struck the back of his head. Justin shrieked and jumped off the stool, startled. He heard giggles and spun to see his little sister sitting on the steps with her tongue sticking out. She'd ripped the catapult cup off his erector set and used it to launch a marble at him. And that's when the call came through. Kevin was in his room, sitting at his desk and pounding his head lightly on his math textbook. He heard the crackle over his walkie, heard the password whispered.
Mickey Mouse has warts.
"Did you hear that?" Kevin was on his walkie with Justin a second later.
I did.
Kevin and Justin arrived at Drew's house in 10 minutes. They'd both been running when they met each other on Mary Street and sprinted together onto Angela Court. The others were in the backyard, standing in the dark shadows of twilight and whispering to each other. "What took you two so long?" Sinetta said. "He wouldn't tell us anything until you got here." They joined the others, and Missy smacked them both with their own hands as she chewed gum. "Hey, it's Tweedledee and Tweedledummer!" Ryan was there, still in his jersey. "Ryan, what the hey is going on?" Kevin asked. Ryan said nothing, but smiled. "Oh, thanks a lot. You're a wealth of knowledge," Kevin snorted. Suddenly, Drew emerged from the field. He wore his burnt black Dimension Warrior jacket and a gun belt strapped around his waist, with a laser pistol occupying the holster. He had his school backpack slung over his shoulder. He saw Kevin and Justin, dropped his bag and ran to them. He pulled them all into a group hug. "I'm sorry I abandoned you guys." "We forgive you," Justin said with more confusion than sincerity. "I snuck out for an apology?" Sinetta frowned. "That's all this is?" Kevin twisted his face in disappointment. "I thought you had a plan or something." Missy blew an enormous bubble as Justin turned to Kevin. "There's no plan, Kevin. We don't have the..." Drew pulled the blue key from inside his shirt. They gasped. the glow illuminating their shock. They crowded around as Ryan leaned in to inspect it. But Sheela had it. Drew shook his head. She gave it back so it wouldn't fall into Malgore's hands. Sinetta said, "Why didn't she tell you she was giving it to you?" "Because I would have given it to them to save her." Justin looked at Drew with a freshly horrified expression. "What does this mean?" "We're it. We're their only hope." He looked at them all somberly. "I'm going after her. I just wanted you guys to know I didn't abandon you again." Ryan said, "Maybe she just wanted you to keep it secret like your mom did." Drew shook his head. "She needs my help." Sinetta poked him in the chest. "I'm sorry, are we not invited?" Helping Sheela find the ship was one thing. Going out there? Drew looked up at the stars. Going out there is another. "You can't pilot the Polar alone," Ryan said. "No, but if I can get it into the Tauran dimension, I can pick up the other warriors." Justin grunted as he cleared his glasses. "That's if they're even still alive. Drew, you saw these things. Gremlins, slores, space pirates, Malgore? That's why he can't go alone," Ryan said. "This is crazy," Missy chewed. "I love it," Sinetta said. "Our parents. People are gonna flip." "Then let's make it a quick trip," Kevin said. Drew sighed. He was afraid of this. But instead of fear, he felt relief. "All right, who's in?" Everyone's hands shot up. Justin shoved his glasses back on. "Only because you wouldn't make it off the ground without your engineer." "Guess we better start digging," Ryan said as he glanced back at the field. "It's gonna take us hours to get down to the trap door." Drew shrugged with a smile. "What?" Ryan asked. "Already did it." Drew turned and they all followed his gaze into the empty sky behind them. "Wait." Ryan dropped his baseball. "It's up there now?" "I'm going tonight." Ryan grabbed his shoulder. "We're going tonight." "But we're stopping by my house," Sinetta said. She blushed. "I at least need underwear." "Me too," Missy said. "It would be good for us all to say goodbye," Justin said. Drew looked back at his house. The moment felt dangerously like his dream. His dad wasn't hunched in the corner with his letter, but Steve was about to lose the only person he had. Drew had left him another letter, but this one promised he'd come back. Kristen was on her last night at the beach. She wandered the lonely shoreline, her feet sinking into the cooling sand as the crabs scuttled about her toes. She'd done away with the makeup and worn the same baggy Outer Banks sweatshirt nearly the entire 2 weeks. She hadn't gone in the water and only strayed out at night. She struggled with anxiety, always watching the sky. The loneliness was crushing, never more so than when she was on the beach under the stars and moon. She watched families hunt ghost crabs with flashlights, laughing and talking and holding hands. It reminded her of Night Tag. The people on the beach were blissfully unaware of what worlds lay beyond and the reality of Malgore. Kristen was sure she was the worst of her friends. After Drew disappeared, she had run, leaving the others behind. She'd learned a lot about herself. She'd learned she would abandon those she loved to save her own skin, and she could never face them again. She had also been haunted by thoughts of Sheela, the alien girl. She must have known what Kristen was. Somehow she knew she would end up a crazy old cat spinster babbling about aliens and government conspiracies. Her life, whatever it would be, would look very different from what it might have been, and she deserved it. As she sat in the cool sand listening to the surf, someone sat down beside her. "Hey." She recognized the voice, but it couldn't be. She turned her head slowly and blinked. Her mind was playing tricks. Drew had just plopped down beside her. He was wearing normal clothes and sitting comfortably, as if he had just appeared out of thin air. "What? How?" she stuttered. "We can't rescue Sheela without a navigator. You're the best one I know. You in?" "What are you doing here?" "We just need to know if you're in." She narrowed her green eyes and hit him in the shoulder. Nearly a month after Jimmy Griffin and the big boys disappeared, 6 more kids from Warfield were reported missing, one of them from 6 hours south of Maryland in the Outer Banks. No one knew what was going on, but to the old men outside of Pete's barbershop, it was all very weird.
The End. Weird Space. Written by A.M. Wiley. Narrated, produced, and edited by the author. Cover design and illustration by Daniel Wiley. Original soundtrack and additional mixing by Caitlin and Selmo. Copyright 2023. For more information, go to WeirdSpaceBook.com.